That the Australian government is stopping its citizens returning home with the threat of criminal sanctions should they make it here. So from Monday, this restriction means that Australians could face up to 5 years in prison and a fine of $50,000 if they make it back from India.
Funerals are taking place today in eastern Afghanistan for the victims of a truck bombing that killed around 30 people and injured dozens more. Explosives hidden inside a vehicle were detonated near a guest house in Puli Alam, the capital of Logar province. Secunda Kamani reports from Islamabad.
Many of those who were killed in the blast in the city of Bole Alam were students preparing to take a university entrance exam. Members of a pro-government militia were also reportedly temporarily staying at the guest house. There are fears levels of violence in Afghanistan are going to increase yet further in the coming months. All remaining US and other NATO forces are being withdrawn by September. They were originally slated to leave by today, May the 1st, but President Biden pushed the deadline back, a move that the Taliban have criticized. With peace talks between the militants and Afghan government stalled, it seems inevitable the conflict will continue.
The president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, has declared a state of siege in 2 eastern provinces that have suffered a wave of violence from armed groups. A government spokesman said the measure was intended to put a rapid end to the insecurity in the North Kivu and Ituri regions. World News from the BBC. The European Union has condemned Russia's decision to put 2 senior EU officials on its latest blacklist, banning them from entering Russia. An EU statement said the move was unacceptable and lacking in any legal justification. Russia's foreign ministry said the EU was pursuing a policy of unilateral and illegitimate restrictions against Russians and was ignoring requests for dialogue. The Colombian president, Ivan Duque, has announced that he will review a controversial tax reform proposal after 3 days of mass protests in cities across the country. However, Mr. Duque insisted that the reforms were crucial to balance the government's budget and guarantee the survival of important benefits and social projects. Trade unions say the changes are unfair and will affect mostly people who are already struggling financially because of the coronavirus pandemic. The Pentagon says the Biden administration is cancelling the construction of Donald Trump's wall along the US-Mexican border. A spokesman said this would free up money to go to other construction projects by the US military, such as schools for the children of soldiers. Building a wall on the border with Mexico was a key policy of Mr. Trump, which he argued was needed to stop illegal immigration. The organisers of the Grammy Awards have scrapped their anonymous voting committees following allegations of rigging. Emily Horler reports.
For decades, Grammy nominations have been chosen by a small, secret group of experts, kept anonymous to stop them being influenced, but also shielding them from criticism. From now on, thousands of members will vote on the awards to try to make the process fairer. A former Grammys chief executive had claimed the voting process was corrupt, and several big music stars, including Zayn Malik and Halsey, have demanded transparency. The Canadian singer The Weeknd said he would boycott future ceremonies after he didn't receive any nominations in 2021. The awards have also been criticised for overlooking artists of colour.
That's the latest BBC News.
It's 6:06 GMT. Welcome to Weekend from the BBC World Service with me, Julian Warwicker. In a moment, we'll go to India and bring you the latest on the coronavirus pandemic there. I'll introduce you in a moment as well to my 2 guests who are with me throughout the programme. But first, this half hour to Israel. The joy of our heart has ceased, our dancing has turned into mourning, a verse from the Book of Lamentations, which has become the headline in one ultra-Orthodox Israeli newspaper. At least 45 people are now known to have died in a crush at a religious festival on Thursday night. Many of the 150 people injured are in a critical condition. The Lag BaOmer festival was the largest public gathering since the easing of Israel's most recent coronavirus lockdown, and crowds of people were packed into a walkway and a stairway. And then there was panic. As one survivor said, there were screams, there was chaos, and I saw children underneath me. Reports as well in the Israeli media today that many more people attended than had been authorised. Well, Tom Bateman is our Middle East correspondent. Tom, a sense of how this has impacted people right across Israel?
Well, it's being described as Israel's biggest civilian disaster, and I mean that's very much the feel you get. I'm still close to the site, and actually one of the issues that has emerged for the families of those who have died in the last 24 hours is that around half of the bodies still haven't been released, and it was very, very important for those families to carry out the burials immediately after the deaths on Friday. That hasn't happened, and I mean that has caused considerable grief for many of those families because it's now Shabbat, the Jewish Sabbath, and the chief rabbi had authorized the pausing of work on formally identifying many of the bodies. One of those injured, actually, that we featured in our coverage on Friday was a man called Avigdor Hayut. He had been with his two young sons, a 10-year-old, a 13-year-old, at the site. They were caught up in the crush. His 10-year-old went down with him, and they were both effectively under a sea of people. The 13-year-old, he told us at the time, remained missing, and the family had been searching for him. Now, they found out later on Friday that the 13-year-old Yedidia had tragically died. But, you know, the real point that he wanted to get across publicly, at least, was that they desperately wanted the body released so that they could carry out the burial before the Jewish Sabbath. That hasn't happened, and that is causing anxiety for many families.
And what of the questions being asked now about how this could have happened?
Well, of course, there is a huge number of questions that are being asked, and something that is emerging is the way in which there were multiple warning signs about the dangers of this site. There have been official warnings, there have been police reports over previous years. I mean, one was even named Erasing the Writing on the Wall, looking at the issue of overcrowding and the possibility of serious injury and death because of the numbers of people at this event. And one police official from the north of Israel in 2013 had talked about, in his view, Mount Meron, this site of the shrine of an ancient rabbi where ultra-Orthodox Jews flock for this festival every year. He said that the maximum capacity that could deal with was 10,000 people safely. Now, that year, they had almost 50 times that, up to about 450,000 people, which gives you a sense of the scale of the event. The numbers were smaller yesterday, around 100,000, but there had been concerns about overcrowding, largely actually due to coronavirus. But there is now plenty of officials picking over who said what and when to allow those numbers to go to the site on Friday.
Tom, thank you very much. Tom Bateman, our Middle East correspondent on events in Israel over the last 48 hours. Now, I have two guests with me throughout the programme. Ulrike Franke is a Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Bruno Massaisch is a Senior Advisor at Flint Global. That's a London-based global consulting firm. He was Portugal's Europe Minister for 2 years, from 2013, and he is a writer as well. Ulrike, a word to you about some research that you've done recently. This is about German millennials. So these are people born towards the end of the 1980s into the mid-1990s, and attitudes to foreign policy. What have you found?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. So this is one of the things I've been thinking about for quite a long time, actually. So as listeners may have been able to deduce from either my accent or my name, I am German originally, and I am indeed a German millennial. And one of the things I realized, especially because, not having lived in Germany for quite a long time, I had this kind of insider-outsider view, if you like. And one of the things I realized is that my generation, so German millennials, I think we struggle quite a bit with thinking geopolitically and thinking strategically. We don't really, quite get the idea of geopolitical power competition. And of course, that's, rather problematic given that geopolitical power competition is very much back. We just discussed this with regard to the US and China. And so I kind of set out and tried to find out, why is that? Why do we seem so unable to deal with geopolitics? And very briefly, I think it's really two things. I think what the moment that really kind of shaped our life is 1989, so the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the 30 years after 1989 were really marked by and quite exceptional geopolitical continuity and quite extreme domestic continuity and calm. So there weren't many things happening on the geopolitical stages, if you like, and especially almost nothing that directly impacted Germany. And we had an extreme domestic continuity with only 3 chancellors over the last 30 plus years. I'm 34 now. I've known 3 chancellors. So that's quite
that's quite revealing, isn't
extraordinary.
it? Yeah. Yes,
Absolutely. And if you compare it to the Brits, I think it's like 7 prime ministers. The Italians had, I think, almost 20 prime ministers at the same time.
Bruno, you mentioned, I think, your 4th book, because you've written 4, you mentioned that at the start of the programme. The most recent one is, I think, a study of the pandemic and the way it's disrupted global order. Is that broadly where you're coming from?
Mm-hmm. That one is coming out in September, so very soon. And I hope to be in London, that travel restrictions will be lifted by then, and I can be there to launch it. It's essentially a book about the long-term effects of the pandemic, and I think I see 2 main ones. I see kind of erosion of global rules, global institutions, a return to unvarnished competition that we're seeing every day. Look at the vaccines. I think it's a good story of that, a good example of that. But also how I think the pandemic might signal the moment when we enter a period of technological acceleration. I think we're also seeing that very clearly. We're seeing it in biomedicine, but also outside biomedicine. And I hope so, in a way, because what we learned this past year is how much we do rely and depend on technology. Imagine what the world would be like now and in coming months if we hadn't these extraordinary vaccines available so quickly and so good. Because even if we had vaccines that were, inactivated virus like the Chinese vaccines are, they wouldn't offer the same reassurance, the same guarantees to people to go back to normal life. So we'd be stuck in this. And Europe and the United States, it kind of showed that without the vaccines, we simply had no way to get out of this. So I hope we learned that lesson and that we regard technology in a much more positive light in coming years.
Bruno Massaisch and Ulrike Franke with me throughout the programme. Bruno talking about the pandemic. We're going to go to India now. The country's struggling to cope with this massive surge in COVID infections. More than 300,000 cases, over 3,000 deaths being reported daily. The burden such that non-governmental organisations are stepping in to help deal with the cremations. And one of those is run by Manish Pal Singh.
We realize that it is so bad that the governments, the administration, no one is really caring about how the things are over here. Forget about beds in hospitals, forget about oxygen. Who's going to care about the management of the dead, No one really cares. So we are doing mass cremations over here. We are bringing the bodies from the homes and people are quarantined at home, they're dying. And then we are getting bodies from the mortuaries and then we are getting about 5 to 6 bodies in just one van. You can imagine the plight of the state over here. It's like 100 to 125 cremations that we are doing every day at just one cremation site.
We'll hear more from Manish Pal Singh a little later in the programme. His is a remarkable story. From today, the country is also beginning a new phase of vaccinations, with all adults now eligible to receive a jab, that in an attempt to stop the spread of the virus. The BBC's Davina Gupta is in Delhi.
It seems to be a continuous struggle, Julian, because the country reached another grim milestone, reporting over 400,000 cases just on Friday, its highest so far globally. And hospitals at major COVID hotspots continue to face shortage of beds, oxygen, and essential medicine supplies. We've seen that at least 18 people lost their lives in that tragic fire at a hospital in the western Indian city of Bharuch in Gujarat, which you just mentioned. And we've seen that India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in a bid to fight this pandemic, has relaxed the age limit of vaccination from today, from 45 years to 18 years. This means that over 600 million people will now be eligible for the jab starting today. So people are being offered 2 vaccines here, but only 6 states will be rolling out this initiative. Others have said that their vaccine reserves are dried up and they need more doses before they can go ahead with the world's largest vaccine program. And that's the worry, because doctors have pointed out that younger people are more at risk in India now. They're seeing fatalities from the age group of below 40 years of age. And this is happening in major COVID hotspots, which is leading to the grim figures that we were talking about.
Yes, it's one thing to change the eligibility of those entitled to a vaccine. It's quite another to have the vaccinations on hand to help people as quickly as you can, isn't it?
Absolutely, Julian, because we're looking at India, which is home to the world's largest vaccine manufacturer. So a lot of people have questioned whether the government failed to capitalize on its strength, whether the policy of changing eligibility and lowering it to 18 years of age was too soon, because we still haven't seen vaccination over 2% of the population so far. India opened its vaccination drive in January to people above 60 years of age. The age limit was lowered to 45 years, but still doses are in short supply, even in other states. And that's why we see that even vaccination centers are struggling with the demand, because now, even as vaccines have been opened up for people above the age of 18 years, are getting queries. They don't have enough staff, they don't have doses, and this will lead to yet another chaos, which the country cannot afford at this point of time.
Our correspondent Davina Gupta, she was in Delhi. We'll hear more from Manish Pal Singh a little bit later in the programme, as I said, and thoughts from my guests on the state of the coronavirus pandemic as well. To Brazil, for the first time, it's been shown that the Amazon rainforest has become a net emitter, not absorber, of greenhouse gases. A study released on Friday said that forest fires and logging are the main causes. A couple of weeks ago, the Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, made a dramatic pledge to the world. Pay us billions of dollars a year, he said, and we will stop deforestation in the Amazon. He says without international assistance, the country won't be able to rein in the destruction. But the offer has been met with scepticism by both environmentalists and foreign governments. As our chief environment correspondent Justin Rolat has been discovering, deforestation has increased dramatically under the current Brazilian government.
Brazil's environmental police are under attack. Loggers and farmers throw bottles and block roads. It is part of an intensifying war to protect the Amazon rainforest. This year has seen the highest levels of destruction for a decade. Around 4,200 square miles of forest have been cut. Now, a senior environmental officer has told the BBC his force's efforts are being undermined by the Brazilian government.
It has become guerrilla warfare. In places where we didn't have incidents in the past, now loggers, prospectors, squatters are rioting. The job is getting more and more risky. People, they feel they have the support from the government.
The Brazilian government has been accused of rolling back environmental protection. Here's Brazil's environment minister speaking in a cabinet meeting last year. We have the chance at this moment when the media's attention is almost exclusively on COVID and not the Amazon, he says. While things are quiet, let's do it all at once and change all the rules. He later said he actually meant simplify the rules. We've just landed the helicopter and the officers are going over to the truck here, which clearly has been it's got freshly cut logs on it. I was with the environmental police on a raid on an illegal sawmill in 2014.
Essa madeira, muito provavelmente, ela é de terra indígena.
Back then, the force was much better funded. Officers say it could be assured of backup from the local police and army and had a free hand to destroy the equipment used for deforestation. She's going to burn it down. In this case, they put the whole place to the torch. Brazilian environmental groups say the effects are clear from the statistics. Fines for deforestation were down 42% between 2019 and 2020. Funding for the environmental police has been reduced by 27% over the last year. Meanwhile, deforestation is up by 34%. The Brazilian government told the BBC it takes protecting the Amazon very seriously. It says poverty is the biggest enemy of the environment. It acknowledged local officials have sometimes withdrawn police protection for environmental officers, but says this is not official policy. And it says the rules on burning the equipment loggers and farmers use have not changed. But environmentalists say actions speak louder than words.
Deforestation rates are going up. Indigenous lands are being invaded. So don't listen to empty words. Let us look at the facts. We need to look at the record of this government rather than what they are saying.
Our environmental police source said the cuts in funding and resources, together with the challenges of COVID-19, meant when we spoke in January, there were no environmental police officers patrolling the Amazon.
That was Justin Rolat reporting. Bruno Massage, clearly if you are somebody who advocates tougher action on climate change on the world stage, you regard Mr. Bolsonaro as being an obstacle to that. But how diplomatically should that be dealt with, do you think?
I think it's going to be very, very difficult. Many of these developments don't have to do with Bolsonaro, I would say, actually. So it makes it even more difficult. This has to do with global structures of trade, demand from China for beef, for soy that is cultivated in these deforested lands, for timber. So we have to change somehow the rules of global trade in order to address these problems. Of course, it would help if Bolsonaro was not there, but the reasons sometimes go deeper than that. And, in Portugal particularly, we have a huge Brazilian community, and Bolsonaro won among that community. So the sense here is actually that Bolsonaro represents somehow a feeling in Brazil that Brazil has been left out of globalization.
Which is
that Brazil has lost as a result of global trade, and so they don't care. Many people in Brazil just don't care about this.
What do you make of his suggestion that if people pay me money from around the world, I'll do more about this?
Yeah, that's but it comes from this sense that the way we have of making money and joining globalization is to do this. That's where the demand is, particularly from China. China also has a role here, and so you have to pay us if we want to sacrifice our economic interests here. I fear, I'm really concerned because I fear we're seeing a fracture between the developing world and the developed world. We've been able to overcome it in the case of China, working with China on climate. But in the case of Brazil and many other countries, that might get worse.
Ulrika Franke, what do you make of Mr. Bolsonaro's offer here?
Yeah, I don't believe it. I mean, I'm sorry to say, but I think we have to look at the record of what he's been doing and not what he's been saying. I think it's rather clear that Bolsonaro is a populist, and I would qualify this statement as a PR stunt. I mean, he has shown no inclination of being concerned about the environment. So even if the international society, the community, China, anyone was willing to pay this, I don't even think that would work. So yeah, it's a terrible situation, but I don't think that Bolsonaro or the international community paying is the answer.
And just briefly, because you were talking about millennials earlier on, if they're not quite as up to speed on global politics as you might have expected, they certainly are on this issue, aren't they?
I mean, certainly in Germany, although I would generally say it's not so much the millennials, although they're part of it, but the next generation.
Yeah.
We have Generation Z now, the kind of Fridays for Future generation, and they are very much concerned with the environment and climate change, and I mean, rightly so.
And we will hear from one of those a little bit later on in the programme, because there's been quite a significant court ruling in Germany on that very subject this week, and we're going to end the programme hearing from exactly one of those voices. 26 minutes past the hour. Time to talk sport with Paul Serres. Morning again, Paul. An excellent week for the English Premier League side, Manchester City, with their victory against Paris Saint-Germain in the Champions League in midweek. It could be about to get better, though, couldn't it?
That's right, Julian. Yes. Good morning. If results go their way this weekend, they could be crowned Premier League champions. They take on Crystal Palace in the early game today. They'd need to win that and hope that the current champions, or the outgoing champions, as the case may be, Liverpool, beat Manchester United in their derby match tomorrow. I'm sure Pep Guardiola, their boss, would love to be able to wrap up the domestic season before that second leg against PSG in the coming week. But he says it's too soon to be talking of the title just yet.
Let me try to win Crystal Palace. Don't ask me what I'm going to feel something when still I didn't feel it, I didn't experience, because it didn't happen. So I'm sorry. I know you are curious to anticipate it, but United is an extraordinary team. When arrived in the last 2 months in the best form in all season, and we need 5 points.
And in the first game of the weekend last night, Leicester rescued a point away at Southampton in a 1-1 draw.
Let's turn to boxing. There was something of a surprise last night in the first of many bouts this weekend.
That's right, indeed there was. Yeah, Britain's Sonny Edwards registered a points win over South Africa's Maruti Mutulani to win the IBF World Flyweight title. Mutulani hadn't lost in 13 years. And Edwards was a big underdog, but boxed brilliantly. And his brother Charlie was also a world champion a few years back at the same weight, at flyweight. Later on Saturday, Derek Chisora faces the former heavyweight world champion, Joseph Parker of New Zealand. Chris Eubank Jr. Chris Eubank is a very famous name in boxing, of course, around the world. He's in action too. And all four of the Irish fighter Katie Taylor's lightweight titles are on the line. She faces Natasha Jonas in a rematch of the 2012 Olympic quarter-final. She says it will be a very different fight this time round.
Professional boxing is obviously a completely different ballgame than amateur boxing, and what works in the pro game isn't going to work in the amateur game and vice versa. So I feel like my style has definitely developed over the last few years, and I feel Tasha's style has developed as well. We both have transformed into top professional fighters.
And what else should we keep an eye on this weekend, Paul?
Tennis at Madrid. The French Open at Roland Garros is under a month away now, so the clay court's in full swing. Back with football, and Inter can seal their first Italian title since 2010 if they win and Atalanta lose. And of course, the World Snooker Championships come to their conclusion this weekend too.
Paul, thank you very much. Paul Serres with your latest sport. You're listening to Weekend from the BBC World Service. My guests today, Ulrika Franke and Bruno Massage. Plenty more to come from them in our final hour. But before that, the latest summary of world news.
Time now to take a look at what else you can hear from the BBC World Service. In an hour, it's When Catty Met Carlos.
Biden declared America is back.
And the administration's taking bold strides.
Can he pull the country together?
At 8 GMT, it's BBC OS Conversations.
India's second wave is producing record numbers of coronavirus cases and daily deaths. Its health system is close to collapse and hospitals are running out of beds and life-saving oxygen supplies. We hear the stories of those trying to help others across a country in crisis.
And the Forum explores the history of the census.
And in order to find out who could fight in wars, ancient governments like the Roman Empire had to find out how many men of a certain age there were. And I would say that the other thing that censuses were most commonly used for was for purposes of taxation.
To hear more, go to bbcworldservice.com.
It's 6:30 GMT. This is Weekend from the BBC World Service. Still to come, a first-hand account of daily life in Delhi from a man who's trying to help transport sick people to the city's hospitals. Plus, why there are shortcomings in our understanding of artificial intelligence. That's all here on Weekend with me, Julian Warwicker, after the latest world news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. India has become the first country in the world to report 400,000 coronavirus infections in a single day. More than 3,500 deaths were also recorded in the past 24 hours. The latest milestone came as India started vaccinating all adults against COVID-19. Officials in the western Indian state of Gujarat say at least 18 people have died in a fire at a hospital treating COVID patients. The cause of the blaze at the Patel Welfare Hospital in the city of Bharuch is being investigated. Australia has banned all its citizens from returning from India and will jail anyone who tries due to the severity of the coronavirus wave. Canberra had already paused direct flights from India to reduce outbreaks in its own hotel quarantine system. New research has found that South Asian communities in England were more at risk of infection, severe illness and death during the second wave of the pandemic than other ethnic groups. Authors of the study, published in the medical journal The Lancet, described the disparity as concerning. The president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, has declared a state of siege in 2 eastern provinces that have suffered a wave of violence from armed groups. A government spokesman said it was intended to put a rapid end to the insecurity in the North Kivu and Ituri regions. Funerals are taking place in eastern Afghanistan for the victims of Friday's trunk bombing that killed around 30 people and injured dozens more. Explosives hidden inside a vehicle were detonated near a guest house in Puli Alam, the capital of Logar province. And the organisers of the Grammy Awards have scrapped their anonymous voting committees following allegations of rigging. BBC News.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Warwicker with Weekend. With me throughout the programme, Ulrika Franke, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Bruno Massaisch, a Senior Advisor at Flint Global, that's a London-based global consulting firm, former Europe Minister in Portugal, and a writer, and more from them to come this half hour as we talk more about the coronavirus pandemic and take you specifically to India, where, of course, the pandemic has reached a disastrous level. Another milestone has been reached today, the country becoming the first in the world to report 400,000 coronavirus infections in a single day. Nearly 3,500 deaths were also recorded in the past 24 hours, although that's widely seen as undercounting. There are acute shortages of oxygen and hospital beds. The situation is particularly bad in the capital, Delhi, where people have been forced to build makeshift funeral pyres as the city runs out of space to cremate the dead. Well, Manish Pal Singh, his brother and father, they run a non-governmental organisation called Shahid Bhagat Singh Suwadal. Based in Delhi, they provide basic emergency services, including transportation to and from hospitals, and they perform last rites. So what's the situation like for him in the capital now?
We started this last year. We all got infected, but we did not stop our services. One of our drivers passed away while doing the services, Now, this is something which we've never seen before. And we realized that it is so bad that the governments, the administration, no one is really caring about how the things are over here. Forget about beds in hospitals, forget about oxygen. Who's going to care about the management of the dead, No one really cares. So we are doing mass cremations over here. We are bringing the bodies from the homes and people who are quarantined at home, they're dying, And then we are getting bodies from the mortuaries, and then we are getting about 5 to 6 bodies in just one van. You can imagine the plight of the state over here, It's like 100 to 125 cremations that we are doing every day at just one cremation site, I was there with my father, my brother. We were all there in the field. Now we have to quarantine. My father is still there right now. As of now, when we talk, he's cremating dead bodies. So 7 o'clock, he goes there. He doesn't stay with us. He's in the parking lot. And he comes back around 12 or 1 in the night,
I mean, it's shattering for the families who have lost a loved one, and then there simply isn't the normal facility available to either bury or cremate that loved one, to perform the last rites, to treat that person respectfully after they've died.
This thing, man, like basic rights, we won't get that, and who is to blame for, the administration over here, they could not fix this right. And now when I see people on the roads dying, now I just feel pity for my nation, that where are we heading, I don't know what are the people sitting in the government or the administration they are doing, what are they doing? They can see everything in the news that there are hundreds and thousands of people dying, and I feel they are just underreporting that. Perhaps they are hiding that, we are short of space. We've started cremating people in the parking lot. We are short of woods. We are just working together to fix what the governments and the administration could not do. So we are helping each other, over here.
You talked about the parking lots. I mean, how common is it if you're driving around the streets of Delhi to see in a parking lot a funeral pyre that somebody has almost made spontaneously because that is their only option?
When we started doing cremations, I remember it was 30 to 40 bodies a day. Then it piled up to 80 bodies a day. Then now it's like it's common practice to do 106, 10, 125, sometimes it goes up to 130 cremations a day. So we had no other options, We had to, start cremating on the pathways. And then finally we thought it's a good space, the parking lot besides the cremation ground. Then it's kind of a mass cremations over here. And you must have seen so many images, so many news agencies, they've released the pictures and they're mostly from this cremation ground, It's horrible. It's horrible, I would say.
It is horrible to see those, I agree.
Yeah.
Tell me about the experience of trying to take people to hospital when they're sick and need treatment. What's the typical experience when you're trying to do that?
I get so distressed calls. It feels like my heart's just out, bleeding, Over here, it's so much of black marketing that's going on. The ambulances here, they are just enjoying this moment, I would say. The ambulance services, they're charging hefty amounts. They're charging about, say, $400 to $500 for about just 10 kilometers, and which is like 10 to 15 times higher in the regular times, So when we get so distressed calls, we just try to rush immediately. But when we see the scenario over there, they feel so pity and we feel so helpless that there's no oxygen with the person. They just say that we are just running short of oxygen. It's just half an hour oxygen left, and then just rush us to the hospital. So we try to rush ASAP, and we've seen so many patients die in our ambulances helplessly. They don't deserve to die just like that, I would say that. It's just because of lack of coordination. It's lack of preparedness simply over here. It's basic thing. Oxygen, they could not do it, and still it's not right. Even the beds, it's been wrongly reported on the government portals that 5,000 beds are available, but when you go to the hospitals, even the media personalities over here, they're fighting. One of the media persons here died today. I would say that it's all a hoax, whatever the government's showing over here, the administration is showing here. We know the real side. We know the patients, they just plead. They plead with so much of money in their hands, but money could not save them, just because we have collapsed drastically over here.
You mentioned young people as well being more affected. Tell me more about that.
Oh my God, let me tell you, we've broken down so many times on the field, man. So, 14 years old girls, and then 28-year-old guys, and then there was a pregnant woman, 27 years old, with a baby. She died, and then they did not even take out her child. She was corona positive, and then we had to burn her with her child. 5 years old children, 35 years old people. I can't tell you when we see that this is not the time they have to go. They've not even seen anything, They've just started their lives. Someone's just doing college, someone's just doing school. It's frightening. I can't tell you, I can't describe you. We cry along with the families. It feels like that it's just happening to us. And we are so helpless. I can't tell you, we break down most often,
That's interesting what you just said. It feels like it's just happening to us because obviously in other parts of the world, countries have had bad experiences but now might be moving into territory which looks more encouraging, and that's certainly true here in the UK. Do you feel particularly isolated in India at the moment because everything that could possibly go wrong seems to be happening where you are?
We all knew that COVID's going to come back. It was all predicted, but somewhere elections are happening. There's so much of flouting of rules. India is a land of festivals, and there was so much of freedom given at that time. No one really cared about it. Now we are paying. We are bleeding. Let me tell you. If I have to rate it, I would rate us in minus in preparedness. There is zero preparedness. Let me tell you. There's nothing over here. Talk about basic facilities. I would say it's all breach of human rights that's happening right now. Very, very, very sad state, let me tell you.
Manish Pal Singh in Delhi with that extraordinary account of what it's like in the Indian capital just now. Ulrika Franke and Bruno Massaish were both listening to that. I mean, leaving aside the politics of this, I mean, Ulrika, it's just devastating on a human level hearing that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's heartbreaking, and this interview was just heartbreaking. And of course, it's terrifying. I mean, especially for India and for Indians, of course, and Indians here in the UK and elsewhere that have family over there. But it's also terrifying for the world in that it reminds us that this pandemic is absolutely not over. And, you know, I'm not a medical or biological professional in any sense of the term, but I'm also really worried about, you know, new variants coming out of, variations of the virus coming out of India. And so, yes, it is heartbreaking and really concerning.
And Bruno, you were talking about some of the work that you've done on the global pandemic for your most recent book. I wonder how the story of India fits into what you have found.
It's a collapse, and it's also a political collapse. It does have to do with Modi, but again, it's not just Modi. I think many Indians are realizing that the state is simply not there, that the task of state building has not been completed, far from it. The stories from India are different. There are stories of complete collapse of social and political structures, of people who, you know, I've read stories of people who paid their whole life savings to buy a cylinder of oxygen, and then it turned out to be empty. I mean, just heartbreaking stories of this kind, and there simply is no state to help people. So, of course, this will be extraordinarily traumatic, and perhaps a moment when India will take seriously some of the tasks that it has to face. That's perhaps the lesson to learn from this. I hope it works that way, and we'll see a more united India. Because another aspect that has shocked me personally is India seems to have fragmented again into social classes and even into castes. Everyone relies on their personal networks, and there's very little sense of being in it together. So there's difficult tasks ahead after the pandemic is over. Hopefully, with the vaccines, it will be.
You touched on something there which might apply to countries beyond India, that those who have been particularly badly affected, do you sense that they might have to take a look at their political systems, the way they structure things, the way they prioritize areas of policy differently because of what they have just gone through?
Yes, I think the pandemic was a test on political systems, on social systems. Some have fared better than others, and I think coming out of it, there will be and there should be a kind of reckoning where we go back and see what's wrong. That also applies to Europe, of course, and even to Germany, as Ulrike will be able to talk about, that many things in Germany that we all thought in Europe were working very well turned out not to be. And we should use the moment after the pandemic to go back to those aspects and try to change them with the knowledge that lives actually depend on this.
Ulrike, the German experience has been interesting, hasn't it? Because it was widely applauded, that's probably too strong a word, but it was regarded as having done well in the initial phase of this. But then it's had setbacks since. And that division between the people running the country from the centre and those running the separate regions of Germany, they have been quite noticeable of late, haven't they?
Yes, absolutely. So Germans have been reminded that we live in a federal system with 16 federal states where, you know, things are being done differently. That being said, I wouldn't count out Germany or the German state on this, because as you rightly pointed out, so Germany actually did very well at the beginning of the pandemic. And when you look at both, you know, number of infected, people in the hospital, and indeed people who died, the numbers are still relatively, comparatively low in Europe. And in a way, that's the most important thing, right? Now, Germany is slow with regard to the vaccination campaign, but that is starting up. So just yesterday, Germany vaccinated over 1 million people in one day. So I'm a bit careful, basically, and to say that this has been, you know, mismanaged and it's not going well, because I think the situation can change quite quickly. And I think it's, you know, more important to have had lower numbers of infected and fewer people who died than being particularly fast with the vaccination, although, of course, that is very important and, again, will speed up in the future, too.
Ulrike Franke and Bruno Massage, my guests today. You're with Weekend from the BBC World Service. To the world of science now, and you might remember this.
Once humans develop artificial intelligence, it would take off on its own and redesign itself at an ever-increasing rate. Humans, who are limited by slow biological evolution, couldn't compete and would be superseded.
That was the late Professor Stephen Hawking, one of Britain's preeminent scientists, telling the BBC back in 2014, and I quote, "The development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race." Well, famously, the theoretical physicist who had motor neuron disease used a new system developed by AI to speak. And artificial intelligence is increasingly part of our lives, from the voice recognition software on your smart speaker at home, facial recognition software at pedestrian crossings, or the kind of social scoring used to reward, and in some countries to control. But what is it, really? Well, Kate Crawford is one of the world's top AI scholars, and in her new book, The Atlas of AI, she argues that we might be wrong in a number of areas about our understanding of AI, starting with the name itself.
One of my favourite tests is just to put artificial intelligence into Google search and to look at images. And you'll tend to see these sort of abstract blue tunnels of numbers and white gleaming robots, but you'll get no sense of how it's actually made. And so the reason that I wanted to write Atlas of AI is to really find out how artificial intelligence is made in the broadest possible sense. And what I discovered, of course, is that it is certainly not artificial. It is extremely material. It is drawn from vast amounts of natural resources and energy, lots of labor throughout the supply chain, and of course harvests extraordinary amounts of data from all of us. And certainly when we think about intelligence, I think there's a real trap that we imagine that large-scale computational systems are anything like human intelligence. They're really not. They're very much trained on the data of the past. So you can imagine the sorts of problems that produces. So yes, in that sense, I think the term artificial intelligence is itself a bit of a misnomer.
I love the word atlas in the title, because that immediately sends me on a journey. And you went on one, didn't you, physically, to do the research that tells this story?
Absolutely. And part of wanting to bring AI back to earth, if you will, really required grounding it, going to the places where AI is made. And we often don't think about the fact that, these sorts of consumer AI devices like an Amazon Echo or an iPhone are made from, in many cases, it's collections of minerals such as rare earth minerals and lithium that are drawn out of the ground. These come from mines. And so part of what I did was to start there, to really start at the Earth's crust. And one of the locations I went to was the last lithium mine in the United States. And what's interesting about lithium is that it's essential for things like reusable batteries. And you have a few grams of it in an iPhone, but you have many, many kilograms in something like a Tesla Model S car usable battery. And by realizing that things like lithium actually have, at the moment, at the very least, the sense that we could actually be running out before we could imagine it. So there's a report that came out just last month indicating that without better recycling practices, we could use up the known reserves of lithium by 2040. So we've really got these critical supply chains now that I think in many ways are imperiled. We have to start thinking, I think, much more carefully around how we use and dispose of a lot of these devices.
You highlight here a lot of what AI can achieve, but also point to many of its flaws, as you have in this conversation. The fact that those flaws exist, what does that say to you about the way this system needs to be regulated?
Well, this, of course, is a very live conversation right now because the EU has just released its proposed guidelines for regulating artificial intelligence. And what's clear is that it's really sort of the first omnibus legislation, this attempt to really look at the many ways in which artificial intelligence is made. But even here, it looks very much at the sort of the technical pipelines of AI. It looks at, the data that's drawn and how it's prepared and categorized, and then what sorts of ways in which those systems are being applied in spaces like policing and facial recognition or healthcare or education. I think what I'm really trying to to suggest in this book, and what has transformed my thinking as a researcher in this space for a long time, is that we really do need to think bigger. We need to think about the broader climatological effects of AI systems, which are so energy hungry and resource intensive. We need to think about the labor supply chains, the many forms of exploited labor from crowd work through to places like Amazon fulfillment centers that I also spent time in while researching this book. And then we also have to think, of course, about all of the sorts of data that are being collected from us every single day that can come back to haunt us in unexpected modes, whether it be when we're going through a hiring process, for example, or in the criminal justice system. There is a half-life of data that I think has really not been contended with. And to some degree, I think this is something that regulation needs to think about, but in this much wider sense of what is the full life cycle of artificial intelligence from birth to death.
But that would require regulation on a grand scale and on an international scale, countries all sitting down round a table when they're allowed to, and coming to some sort of conclusion on something which is just so big that they might think, I don't think I can deal with that. Is that your fear here?
My fear is that we're at a time in history when trust in institutions is at an all-time low, when we see growing disinformation and polarization, and certainly, I think, an erosion of a commitment to international governance. But certainly, if there's one thing that the pandemic has shown us, and certainly that climate change is continuing to show us, is that we absolutely need those global fora. We are going to need a commitment to coming up with agreements that span nation states, because otherwise what we're currently seeing, certainly when it comes to AI, is this concentration of power into AI superstates. And of course, there's a lot of talk about the US and China, being in an AI war. But I actually think that in a way is also, I think, often manipulated to the worst ends, whereas what we should be thinking about is, as you say, what does international governance look like here?
Stephen Hawking once warned that artificial intelligence could end mankind. Did he have a point?
It's really strange. You can think about these polar opposites of tech utopianism, where technology is going to save the day and solve all of our problems. And on the other end, you have this sort of tech dystopianism. It's also described as, the singularity, this idea that AI will rise up and overthrow humans and become more intelligent than anything that humans can construct or respond with. Personally, I actually think there's a problem with both of these frames, which is that they put technology always at the center. These are systems that we build, and they're flawed systems. And we have to be extremely cautious before we feed them into high-stakes institutions like education, healthcare, and criminal justice. So I think in that sense, it really helps if we start to demystify artificial intelligence and sort of move away from this sort of enchantment around AI. I think we'll start to see much more clearly where it serves us and where it fails us.
Kate Crawford, her new book is called The Atlas of AI. Ulrika Franke, this is very much your field. I wonder what you would say off the back of what you've just heard from Kate Crawford.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this book, Atlas of AI. I have to say, I haven't had a chance yet to get it, but I'm very much looking forward to it. And I really like the way that Kate was framing it, looking beyond the typical AI triad that we normally look at. So normally we look at kind of data, talent, and compute, the kind of three key elements that feed into artificial intelligence. And I liked how she basically said, well, there's a material element here. We need to look at the supply chains and the resources that go into this. I think that's a very useful way of looking at this. But of course, I'm particularly interested in the geopolitical, the political elements. She was talking about the AI superpowers and this alleged race between the US and China. And of course, there's a question, well, where's Europe and where's the EU and all of that?
And what does that say to you about the debate about regulation of this area?
Well, I mean, I think it's really important to note that the European Union has just put out this big regulatory effort. It's come from the Commission, and now it needs to go through several steps. But the EU really has put itself at the forefront of trying to regulate AI, and as Kate was saying, this is the first kind of omnibus regulation. It looks at many different aspects, and I think that's very important. The EU, of course, is trying, as I was saying, to put itself at the forefront of regulation and really trying to shape AI the way, for example, it did through the GDPR, which I think a lot of listeners will know, the
That's
kind of
the
data
privacy
privacy,
regulation, yeah.
exactly, the data privacy regulation that we see when we go online. But I think where the EU was clearly leading in this thinking about data privacy at a time when almost no one else was, I think the same isn't quite the case when it comes to AI, because a lot of actors are trying to come up with rules and ethical guidelines and things like that. So it's going to be harder for the EU to really make its mark here.
Bruno, what does a former Europe minister say to that?
Well, first of all, great to hear from Kate, and I'm looking forward to the book. I'm not completely happy about what I'm hearing. It's been going on, the debate at the EU level for a few years, 2 or 3 years. I see the perspective as too negative on AI. You know, we started this segment talking about how AI could destroy mankind. Well, AI could also save mankind. We wouldn't have mRNA vaccines without AI. We certainly wouldn't have them now. We wouldn't have AlphaFold developed by DeepMind there in London, which is, I think, a breakthrough in how we're going to be able to treat cancer and many other diseases. We wouldn't have it without AI. It's a deep learning algorithm, essentially.
But you can regulate it and still have all that, can't you?
Exactly.
I'm not sure, because I think we should start from the possibilities and the opportunities. I have the regulation here in front of me. There's 4 articles of definitions. Article 5, prohibited artificial intelligence practices. This is how it starts, rather than talking about the possibilities, the hope, the optimism that AI can introduce into our lives.
We're coming up to the news, but I wanted to give Ulrika just a sort of 20 seconds to respond to that.
Yeah, so I don't agree,
because there are doubters out there, aren't there?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's right to be, I think we should be positive towards the technology and the things that it proposes, but we can still be skeptical with regard to certain applications and try to regulate those. And I think that's what the EU is doing, and I would support that.
Okay. We must leave that particular conversation there because the news is imminent. Ulrika Franke and Bruno Massage, my guests today. More from them in our final half hour. As I say, the news is next.
This is the BBC World Service, where Harriet Gilbert brings us the next World Book Club.
Miss Jane Neal met her maker in the early morning mist of Thanksgiving Sunday.
It's the detective mystery Still Life by Louise Penny.
I sat down and I created a village I would choose to live in and characters I would want to hang around with, because I knew it would take me a few years to write the book, which it did.
World Book Club, today at 11 GMT. And in 30 minutes, when Catty met Carlos.
Biden declared America is back.
And the administration's taking bold strides.
Can he pull the country together?
I'm Catty Kay of the BBC World Service.
And I'm Carlos Watson of Aussie Media.
Join us.
Now it's back to weekend. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service, it's 7 hours GMT. Welcome to Weekend with Julian Warwicker. India has become the first country in the world to record more than 400,000 coronavirus infections in a single day. We'll hear from one man whose family is working all hours to help with cremations.
We are short of space. We've started cremating people in the parking lot. We are short of wood. We are just working together to fix what the governments and the administration could not do.
We'll reflect on a court ruling in Germany this week that young climate activists see as an important victory.
It basically says that our rights in the future and the rights of future generations are as important as the rights of today's generations.
And what impact will the pandemic and lockdowns have on elections in the Spanish capital, Madrid? That's all coming up here on Weekend after the latest world news.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. India has become the first country in the world to report 400,000 coronavirus infections in a single day. More than 3,500 deaths were also recorded. The latest milestone comes as the country continues to struggle with acute shortages of oxygen and hospital beds. From Delhi, here's Davina Gupta.
India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been emphasizing on the need to vaccinate the population. He's so far opposed a national lockdown, which critics say is needed to break the cycle. He's pushed the program for phase 3, where now people who are above the age of 18 years will be eligible for jabs. And this adds another 600 million more people to the vaccination cycle. But only 6 states in India will be rolling this initiative because there is a shortage of vaccine in the country. And this despite India being world's largest vaccine manufacturer.
Reports from the western Indian state of Gujarat say at least 16 people have died in a fire at a hospital treating COVID patients in the city of Bharuch. Here's Naresh Kaushik.
Pictures on social media show smoke rising from the Patel Welfare Hospital with the fire brigade trying to control the blaze. An official at the hospital told the BBC that the fire had been put out but had caused considerable damage. A large number of patients have been moved to other hospitals in the city. This is the third fire at a COVID hospital in Western India in a week. The other 2 blazes happened in the neighbouring state of Maharashtra, killing 17 people. Both states are among the worst affected by the huge second wave of the coronavirus in India.
Australia has made it temporarily illegal for its citizens to return home from India to protect itself from a surge in coronavirus cases. From Monday, anyone who's been to India in the past 2 weeks cannot come home, and if they break the new law, they face up to 5 years in prison. New research has found that South Asian communities in England were more at risk of infection, severe illness and death during the second wave of the pandemic than other ethnic groups. Jim Reid has more details.
It has confirmed that nearly all ethnic minority groups were disproportionately affected by the first wave of COVID up to September, with higher rates of hospital admissions and deaths. In the second wave, the differences for people from a black or mixed ethnic background narrowed compared with those who said they were white. But for South Asian communities, the opposite was true. Differences widened, especially for those from a Pakistani or Bangladeshi background. Researchers said a higher prevalence of other health conditions could be one reason for that, along with a greater number living in larger, multi-generational households.
You're listening to World News from the BBC. A World Trade Organization meeting has failed to agree on a proposal to waive patent rules for pandemic-related products. The 60 countries backing the waiver say it would allow more companies to produce vaccines without being limited by intellectual property laws. But the plan by South Africa and India has been opposed by mainly developed economies. They argue it might stop voluntary collaborative efforts to increase supplies of goods like vaccines. Funerals are taking place in eastern Afghanistan for the victims of Friday's truck bombing that killed around 30 people and injured dozens more. Explosives hidden inside a vehicle were detonated near a guest house in Logar province. Several students are among the dead, and it's thought that members of a pro-government militia were also staying at the guest house. The president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, has declared a state of siege in 2 eastern provinces that have suffered a wave of violence by armed groups. A government spokesman said the measure was intended to put a rapid end to the insecurity. The organisers of the Grammy Awards have scrapped their anonymous voting committees following allegations of rigging. Nominations and winners for next year's event will now be chosen by thousands of members instead of small unnamed groups, as Peter Bowes in Los Angeles explains.
They've had this system for the big categories, so that's album, song, record of the year, best new artist. The system involving secret committees, and these committees have been made up of 15 to 30 industry executives, music experts who've been responsible for choosing the nominees. It was thought, at least at the time, that it would improve the selection of nominees. The key concern was that there were members of these committees, unnamed members, who would favour their musician friends who they had associations with.
BBC News.
7:06 GMT. Welcome to Weekend from the BBC World Service with me, Julian Warwicker. I have two guests with me throughout the programme, Ulrika Franke, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Bruno Massaisch, Senior Advisor at Flint Global. That's a London-based global consulting firm. He was Portugal's Europe Minister from 2013 to 2015, and he is a writer. Now let's turn to India, first of all, this hour, the country becoming the first in the world to report 400,000 coronavirus infections in one single day. Nearly 3,500 deaths were also recorded in the past 24 hours, although that's widely seen as undercounting. There are acute shortages of oxygen and of hospital beds. And the situation is particularly bad in the capital, Delhi, where people have been forced to build makeshift funeral pyres as the city runs out of space to cremate the dead. The burden is such that non-governmental organisations are stepping in to help. One of them is run by Manish Pal Singh.
We realize that it is so bad that the governments, the administration, no one is really caring about how the things are over here. Forget about beds in hospitals, forget about oxygen. Who's going to care about the management of the dead, No one really cares. So we are doing mass cremations over here. We are bringing the bodies from the homes and people are quarantined at home, they're dying. And then we are getting bodies from the mortuaries and then we are getting about 5 to 6 bodies in just one van. You can imagine the plight of the state over here. It's like 100 to 125 cremations that we are doing every day at just one cremation site.
Manish Pal Singh. Well, the country's also beginning a new phase of vaccination with all adults now eligible to receive a jab, this in an attempt to stop the spread of the virus. The decision came after the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, chaired a high-level meeting with the country's top doctors last week. So while infections and deaths are rising exponentially in India, can we expect the expansion of the vaccination programme to help reduce those catastrophic figures? Well, Professor Srinath Reddy is president of the Public Health Foundation of India. That's a non-governmental organisation. And he's on the line live from Delhi. Professor, good morning from London.
Good morning.
The vaccination programme and the expansion of it, what difference will that make, do you think?
Well, the decision to actually make the vaccination programme available to all adults above the age of 18 was taken with two assumptions. Firstly, that the young people in the age group of 18 to 44 are likely to become super spreaders because of their high mobility. And secondly, recent data suggesting that some of the younger people are also getting seriously infected and are contributing to some of the deaths. So both from the vulnerability point of view and also for preventing them becoming active transmitters of the virus, this decision was taken. However, the problem is related to the availability of adequate number of vaccines. Having about 595 million people entering this additional bracket between 18 to 44, which means that about 1.2 billion doses of vaccine will be required, apart from those already waiting for their second doses of the first vaccination in the 45 plus age group. That is actually adding to serious logistical challenges, and many of the states have announced that they are not going to undertake this effort from 1st of May as planned.
Which is potentially so disheartening, isn't it, for a population that's already dealing with the severity of the crisis as it is. It's given a ray of hope by the suggestion that some vaccination programme can suddenly be expanded to deal with it, but in reality, only in certain parts of the country can that happen.
Yes, indeed. For example, in Delhi, 2 private hospitals have announced that they have the stocks of vaccine available to vaccinate. But what about the rest of the general population, many of whom may not be able to afford going to private hospitals? So it is a challenge that we need to meet. Somehow we need to procure the vaccines from abroad, even as we ramp up our production as fast as possible.
Yet, India is the biggest producer of vaccines globally, and that's one of the horrible ironies of this, isn't it?
I think our miscalculation, which it undoubtedly was based on the presumption that there wouldn't be a second wave, that we could have a slow and steady, graduated vaccination program in which we start with essential health workers, then other essential workers, and then move on to people with 45 plus age group with comorbidities, but 60 plus without even having a comorbidity. So I think this graduated approach has been a problem because we did not plan our vaccine requirements based on that. Now that there is a sudden surge and an urge as well now to vaccinate everybody who is an adult, we are suddenly caught short of our vaccine stocks.
Although clearly, even when vaccinated, it takes a few weeks for that vaccination to take its full effect, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Firstly, there is no gilt-edged guarantee that anybody who is fully vaccinated will not even get mild infection and transmit some of the virus to others. That requires continued masking and continued precautions against overcrowding. But even assuming that there is a sufficient impact on transmission and building up immunity for protection, that takes 6 to 8 weeks total. So that is the benefit on reducing the transmission is a delayed effect. What we now need to do is to crack down on public gatherings of any size of more than 5, and also ensure that anybody who steps out of the house is masked, and anybody who steps into an indoor building is double masked.
And when you look at the way these figures are moving at the moment, is it possible to predict when the peak might be hit here?
Well, some of the modelers have said that we will probably start seeing the cases coming down from the middle of May and the deaths possibly following 2 weeks thereafter in terms of daily case counts and death counts. But again, we'll have different calendars across different parts of the country because the second wave started earlier in some cities and then later in some other parts of the country. But all this is on the presumption that we actually undertake active containment measures, ensuring that we are not going to have any crowded super spreader events and that we will have everybody masking. And the concern is very legitimate because tomorrow, on the 2nd of May, the election results for many state assemblies as well as many local body elections across the country will be announced. The counting of votes will take place. We are dreading the prospect of election victory celebrations, which of course have been forbidden by the Election Commission, but that can be a very negative counterpoint.
Thank you very much for your thoughts, Professor Srinath Reddy, President of the Public Health Foundation of India. You're listening to Weekend. Now, on Tuesday, the Spanish region of Madrid will hold an election. During the COVID pandemic, the Conservative local government of the Spanish capital and its immediate surroundings has prided itself on trying to keep businesses, bars and restaurants open more than many other regions. This approach to the pandemic has divided opinion, and it means that the ballot is widely seen as a referendum on the local government's handling of coronavirus, as Guy Hedgecoe now reports from Madrid.
Workers at a food market down tools to applaud Madrid's regional president, the Conservative Isabel Díaz Ayuso. Her campaign slogan, the single word freedom, has struck a chord with them and many other voters who welcome her determination to keep Madrid open for business. I'm in the La Latina district of Madrid, right in the centre of the city, next to a bar where people are sitting outside having drinks, all of them, as far as I can tell, without masks on, and a street musician, a trumpeter, is blowing away in the corner. And this is a very typical scene here in the capital and has been over the last few weeks and months. And Madrid is probably the city in Spain with the loosest restrictions when it comes to COVID. In the regional government headquarters, Ms. Ayuso, a member of the Popular Party, explains her philosophy.
During the hardest months of the pandemic, we have shown that living the Madrid lifestyle means people work responsibly, they are treated as adults, and thanks to comparisons with other places, more and more people in Spain and elsewhere in the world have been won over by our message of freedom and prosperity.
Madrid has one of the highest infection rates in Spain at the moment. Was this a conscious decision to put the economy ahead of healthcare? Has that been your priority?
The figures in Madrid are not going to be able to change much because we have a higher population density than other parts of the country. We have one of the largest populations, but in a relatively small territory. So there's no way that Madrid can avoid contagion because the more you close things down here, the more contagion increases.
Disagreement over how to manage the pandemic has frequently pitted Ms. Ayuso against the central government of socialist Pedro Sánchez. On the streets of Madrid, opinions are mixed about how the local government has handled the health situation.
Madrid government has clearly not invested money enough to manage our health crisis. You can't have a healthy economy without having healthy people.
I like it. I like to be able to have fun with my friends, go out for a drink, for a coffee, in a bar.
But this election is not just about coronavirus. It also reflects the deep polarisation between left and right, which can be seen nationwide. Pablo Iglesias, leader of the leftist Podemos party, has resigned as a minister from Spain's coalition government in order to run against Ms. Ayuso. In recent days, the temperature of the campaign has risen as several politicians have received death threats in the mail. Mr. Iglesias, who has been one of the targets of the threats, says the blame for them lies with the political right.
The fascist way of doing things, the lies, the provocations, the aggression, it all forms part of the modus operandi of the right and the far right which came from it.
While Isabel Díaz Ayuso and her Popular Party are favourites to win, many are wondering if she will need to enter a coalition with the far-right Vox Party in order to govern. If so, the politics of Madrid and Spain could get even more confrontational.
That was Guy Hedgecoe reporting from Madrid. Listening to that, Bruno Massage, I wonder how you reflect on the fact that so many elections, whether they're local, regional or national, being held at the moment, are bound to be determined to a large extent by the way the public perceives the handling of the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's right. It is all about the pandemic now. We are going to have elections here in Lisbon as well pretty soon, in just a few months, and the campaign has started, and it is also about the pandemic, how the city of Lisbon has responded to the pandemic. There are, of course, here opportunities for the left, a government that cares, a government that is more concerned about citizens than about profit, let us say. That's a powerful message right now. But of course, the right also has some weapons that it can use. We've become more suspicious of foreigners. We've become more interested in a strong state. It's going to be a very interesting moment in Europe, I think, a sort of a restart where some of these questions are going to be reopened. It's going to be intense. As you could see from the piece, in Spain, it's getting a bit too intense.
And more divisive, not just in Spain, but elsewhere, do you think?
Yeah, I think the stakes are higher and the differences are probably going to be more pronounced. A certain polarization is inevitable. I mean, that is exciting and there are opportunities, but I think we also have reason to be a bit anxious about politics in the next few years.
Ulrika Franke, would you agree with that?
I also worry about the polarization. I mean, I think there are three observations I would like to share when it comes to the kind of international political consequences of the pandemic. The first is, I think it's important to note how badly populists have done, both from the left and the right. I mean, Bolsonaro, Modi, Trump, etc. I also think, secondly, that the pandemic has kind of shown once again that you really shouldn't bet against the US. I think that's been really quite striking, how badly the US did initially and how strong they're coming out of it now with the vaccination. And then just third, I mean, things are still very much in movement. Things are still changing. You know, the UK did really badly in the pandemic itself with high infection and hospitalization and death rates, and is now doing really well with the vaccination program. For Germany, it's the other way around, but things can still change. And so their impact on politics and on elections also can still change.
Some thoughts about the situation in Germany to come from you in a moment, particularly politically, because there are some key elections coming up there in a few months' time. But young climate activists in Germany did score a major victory this week. That's certainly how they saw it. The country's constitutional court ruled that the government's climate protection measures are insufficient to protect them and to protect future generations. In a groundbreaking ruling, the judges said the government now had until the end of next year to improve its Climate Protection Act. Well, I've been speaking to Luisa Neubauer, an activist from Fridays for Future. That's the global climate strike movement started by Greta Thunberg.
Over 1 year ago, in February 2020, a number of young activists filed a case against the German government and its climate law. And we argued back then that this climate law is too weak to protect our rights and our rights in the future. The court in Germany ruled that indeed this climate law is too weak to protect us. They decided that we have a fundamental right to a human future. And that's huge because it basically says that our rights in the future and the rights of future generations are as important as the rights of today's generations, which completely changes the way of thinking climate politics.
The law you're talking about is the Climate Protection Act, which was passed in 2019, and Angela Merkel said of it at the time, it's a turning point in Germany's efforts to battle climate change. There were goals there, weren't there, aiming to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% and to have virtually no emissions by 2050. So how much further do you want them to go?
Well, this isn't a question of what I or we want, but it's a question of science and what works out in line with Paris. Germany is one of the largest emitters worldwide, and our responsibility is a different one than other countries have. And our coal power plants are firing up the climate as we speak. What the government decided back then is to deliberately stay behind what is our role in this.
But you've got to take the people with you, haven't you? And if you try and push people too quickly or too far, they're going to resist it. And that's what the politicians are trying to weigh up here, isn't it?
Well, I would actually disagree with you on this here, because what politicians have been doing in the past, and especially our government has been doing in the past, is telling people that the biggest threat that we are facing comes from climate action. And that is wrong. That is also what the court decided was the wrong way around, because the big threat we are facing comes from the climate crisis if we don't act fast enough. This won't work out if we aren't honest about where the danger comes from and what we are facing if we don't act.
And talk to me about the significance of young people being involved in this. Is it right that your argument currently stands that not enough is being done now, which will mean more will have to be done in the future, and therefore people of your generation are the ones who are going to have to pay most?
Yes, exactly. That is what the court ruled. Right now, climate politics is designed in a way that very little is being done today, which means more has to be done in the future, but also more catastrophes will await in the future. And given that now they officially ruled that future generations have the same rights as today's generations, this won't work out anymore simply because it's the responsibility for governments, to not add additional burden to us in the future. So this means, they need to act now and they need to stick to what they promised with the Paris Agreement and are, in a sense, forced to end this kind of search for excuses to not do something, given that the climate disaster is already escalating as we speak. Yeah.
So you've had this victory in the court. What do you plan to do now?
Now we have a new foundation, in a sense, on which we can base our action and arguments. But of course, we know that this ruling itself won't change things. It's up to us to fight for those rights we were given. So obviously, we have 22 more weeks until we have a federal election in Germany, and we will do everything we can to turn these 22 weeks into a marathon of climate action. We are mobilizing in every corner of the country. We are uniting with labor unions and social unions. We're working together with churches and with schools and, really trying to build a very broad alliance to unite people behind climate justice demands and make sure that the government doesn't get around acting up. Right now, we're in a point where we can make decisions about our future. And the longer we wait with actions, the less decisions will there be for us to make. And we decided to stand up now, and we find ourselves to be in very good company.
Luisa Neubauer from Fridays for Future. Ulrike, how much do you think that court ruling we were talking about, how much does that matter, do you think?
I think it matters. I mean, it's not the most decisive moment, but as Luisa Neubauer was just saying, it does give the movement yet another, foundation on which to base their actions on. It gives them another boost, and certainly, I mean, I think what's important to note is that climate change and the kind of looming climate catastrophe, that is something that actually has been in German politics for, well, ever since I can remember. So this isn't exactly new, but then at the same time, it is true that this new Generation Z, that it is called, the whole Fridays for Future movement, they really have put this at the forefront. And now there is a possibility that in September, Germany will get its very first green-led government. That is, not certain yet, but could happen. And what is almost guaranteed is that the Green Party will be in government, in coalition government, once again. So we were seeing real political repercussions.
And Bruno Massage, the other aspect of this is whether you agree with the specific points raised by an activist like Luisa Neubauer. It's that engagement of young people in politics, isn't it?
It's impressive. She knows exactly where she wants to go. Many politicians don't. And I think explains her success. There was an interesting moment when you asked her, is this about what you want? And she said, it's not about what we want, it's about science. Now, I find that slightly perplexing. We still have to find a way to make science and democracy compatible. But clearly, this drive, it's also very different from young activism in the 60s or 70s, right? Where the answer would be the opposite. It's not about the science, it's about what we want. But this is grounded in science, it's very powerful, and I think it's having an impact all over Europe, probably because there's so little else, and this is probably one of the most exciting developments in recent time.
Well, on that note, we must end the discussions because the programme is drawing to a close. Thank you both very much indeed for being a part of the programme today. Bruno Massage, former Europe Minister for Portugal, writer, and Ulrike Franke, who's been with us throughout as well. And thank you for listening to this edition of Weekend. The programme back at the same time tomorrow. Make sure you join us then. The news headlines are coming up next, and look out for News Hour in a few hours' time as well here on the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service, where Dan Stevens with Martha Wash continues.
Hi, people like to call me the Queen of Clubland. I'm celebrating the pioneering women of New York's underground dance music scene.
They'd set up a meeting, and when I walk in, and he was like, "Who are you?" And I said, "Yo, man, you asked for me." I said, "Oh, I thought you was a dude."
The overlooked singers, DJs, and producers who helped create the sound of dance music. In part 2, I look at how female vocalists had to fight to get credit for their work in the 80s and 90s.
When the a cappella was released, people just took bits and pieces from it because it was a hit.
It was a time of incredible creativity, but raised huge questions about authenticity and authorship.
Dan Stevens at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries.
President Biden promised to restore the soul of America.
He took hold of the reins during a time of crisis.
Can his administration pull the country together?
I'm Katty Kay of the BBC World Service.
And I'm Carlos Watson of Aussie Media.
Join us as we look back on Biden's first 100 days.
That's coming up on When Katty Met Carlos after the news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. India is launching an expanded vaccination program as it struggles to tackle an escalating coronavirus crisis, reporting more than 400,000 new infections in the last 24 hours. From today, all adults over the age of 18 are eligible to receive a first dose of the vaccine. But many states, including some of the worst affected, say they don't have any doses to give. Australia has banned its own citizens from returning from India and will jail anyone who tries due to the severity of the coronavirus wave. Canberra had already paused direct flights from India to reduce outbreaks in its hotel quarantine system. New research has found that South Asian communities in England were more at risk of infection, severe illness and death during the second wave of the pandemic than other ethnic groups. Authors of the study, published in the medical journal The Lancet, described the disparity as concerning. The president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Félix Tshisekedi, has declared a state of siege in 2 eastern provinces that have suffered a wave of violence from armed groups. A government spokesman said it intended to put a rapid end to the insecurity in the North Kivu and Ituri regions. 11 people have been killed in China during a storm in which some people are reported to have been blown into the Yangtze River. A video posted on social media showed the high winds spinning round a large passenger plane parked on an airport runway in the city of Nantong. Other images revealed overturned trees and roofs that had been ripped from buildings. The organisers of the Grammy Awards have scrapped their anonymous voting committees following allegations of rigging. Nominations and winners for next year's event will now be chosen by thousands of members instead of small, unnamed groups. BBC News.
Carlos, we have a little bit of a bittersweet moment because we've come to the end of this series of When Catty Met Carlos, and we will be back at the end of the summer, but for the moment, we are taking a pause.
Indeed we do. I still remember us discovering our mutual love of Casablanca.
And I think When Harry Met Sally was both of our second favourite films too, hence the name of the show.
It was. What a wonderful and unexpected run we've had here together. It's been great.
We've touched so many areas of American life, America that is changing as we are speaking.
I mean, Catty, think about how different the America that we live in today is here in April versus the one that you and I originally started chatting about. I feel like we've been lucky to have some of these conversations about everything from conspiracy theories to Gen Z and back.
Yeah, and to be able to step back a little bit from what has been a very tumultuous news period and examine these underlying big shifts that are happening in the country. And I don't think it's over. You keep saying this to me, that we are entering a period in America of big, exciting, tumultuous, perhaps uncomfortable change. And what a great time to have a way to talk about it.
Yeah, I have felt like this has been the ultimate treat to be here with you on this. And now we look ahead not only at what Biden has done his last 100 days, but what maybe he could do in the days ahead.
And we will be back late in the summer to talk about it all.
As Nixon once famously said, tan, rested, and ready.
I love that. I'm hoping so.
Indeed.
Hello, I'm Catty Kay in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
Welcome to When Catty Met Carlos,
a new show exploring what's shaping America today, brought to you by the BBC World Service and Aussie Media. Since the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it's become a tradition of American politics to assess the performance of a new president after their first 100 days in office. During a similar period, President Roosevelt pushed through 15 pieces of major legislation, forming the foundation of the New Deal, an effort to lift the U.S. out of the Great Depression. President Biden, too, has found himself taking office during a time of crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, widespread racial justice protests, political polarization, and a climate crisis, just to name a few.
Former President Trump used to refer to his competitor as Sleepy Joe. And yes, it has been quieter in Washington since he's taken office. There are no midnight tweets from him. But so far, it would be hard to conclude that the Biden-Harris administration has appeared tired. In his first 3 days in office, President Biden signed 30 executive orders and actions, many overturning his predecessor's policies. And he's got his $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan through Congress. It's been a busy 3 months.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
the
office of President of the United States.
office of President of the United States.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
And I pledge this to you. I will be a president for all Americans. As we've indicated earlier, we're going to be signing a number of executive orders over the next several days to week. And the first order I'm going to be signing here relates to COVID.
Today, President Biden is continuing his commitment to embedding equity at the center of his agenda.
The president has declared a major disaster in 77 Texas counties as residents continue to struggle in the aftermath of a deadly winter storm.
A growing crisis is unfolding at the U.S.-Mexico border as we learn many of those crossing are young children.
As of yesterday, more than 100 million payments of $1,400 have gone into people's bank accounts. U.S. troops, as well as forces deployed by our NATO allies and operational partners, will be out of Afghanistan before we mark the 20th anniversary of that heinous attack on September 11th.
We are all a part of George Floyd's legacy, and our job now is to honor it and to honor him.
We did it. 200 million shots in 100 days.
He campaigned to get the country back on track, and it's certainly been a bold start. With 2 more major bills on their way, the ambition of the Biden administration has surprised even some within his own party. The policy appears to be to underpromise and overdeliver. As with the vaccine rollout, where the country sailed past his original target, and now more than 230 million doses have been given. But with the midterms on the horizon in 2022, the administration doesn't have long before its first major electoral challenge.
We'll be hearing from a Republican voice later, but first, to look back on the first 3 months with us is Beto O'Rourke, the former Democratic congressman from El Paso, Texas. In 2018, he captured national attention when he ran a hard-fought campaign to unseat Senator Ted Cruz in the deeply Republican state. In 2019, O'Rourke ran for president, competing for the Democratic nomination, but he dropped out and he later backed Joe Biden. Beto O'Rourke, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
Thank you. When you campaigned for the Democratic nomination, you said that the Democratic Party needed bold, new ideas, and you felt that Joe Biden wouldn't bring those. 3 months in, do you still think that Biden is a return to the past?
I think President Biden is precisely the person that we need at this moment. We're confronting the greatest set of challenges I think that this country has ever known. Most importantly among them, this climate crisis, but that also includes the pandemic, the worst in the last 100 years, the recession that followed the pandemic, the worst since the Great Depression, and a host of other challenges, not the least of which is a very concerted attack on democracy itself. There are more than 300 voter suppression bills pending in over 47 state legislatures, and on the eve of President Biden's inauguration, you literally had a storming of the United States Capitol, the first successful invasion of our seat of democracy since the War of 1812. Against those challenges, I think he's doing extraordinarily well in just these first 100 days. So, yes, he surprised a lot of us, especially those of us who were running in that Democratic primary. I mean, many of us probably wouldn't have gotten into that primary if we knew that Joe Biden would be the kind of president that he has shown himself to be so far.
Beto, as you look at where Texas is today, not only in relation to Biden, but where Texas was on behalf of President Trump, Texas voted for President Trump, how do you think Texas is receiving Biden, and what does that say to you about where the country is more broadly?
I'll tell you, there's a lot of gratitude in this state for President Biden in the wake of a terrible winter storm and then a man-made power outage that cost the lives of more than 200 of our fellow Texans. The Biden administration came to the rescue of Texas and made sure that whether you lived in a big city or a rural county, they were there to help. In the face of more than 50,000 dead from COVID in this state, his effort and singular focus on getting vaccines into the arms of our fellow Americans has transformed this state and what is possible for us, certainly in terms of healthcare outcomes, but that's related to our ability to overcome the recession, to find jobs, and to get this economy going again. So he's made a very positive impression on this state. And we recently got census information that shows that Texas will pick up 2 new congressional seats, which brings our electoral college total to 40 electoral college votes. That will clearly make Texas the biggest battleground state in the country. And I think these signal successes in Texas bode well for his chances in 2024 and for Democrats at all levels of the ballot.
And Beto, let me push on that if I can, because to your point, we did see breakthroughs in unexpected battleground states like Georgia and Arizona in the last election, where Biden and Democrats outperformed versus expectation. But we didn't see it in Texas. What does that tell you that it didn't happen? Because I know how hard you were working to try to make that happen.
We got a lot closer. Joe Biden performed better than Hillary Clinton did in 2016, who performed better than Barack Obama had done in 2012. So we're seeing strong signs of progress. But we should remember, when we look at Georgia, for example, that was a 10-year project. And it involved the kind of painstaking, tough work of being at people's doors and persuading them not so much to vote for Democrats, but in a very heavily voter-suppressed state to vote at all. And that's something that we definitely learned from Stacey Abrams and Nsé Ufot and others who led that grassroots effort in Georgia. Something very similar is taking place in Texas. But we should remember, it's a much larger state. On the first day of early voting in 2020, for example, the same number of people voted in Harris County, home to Houston, Texas, as voted in the entire state of Georgia. There are 254 counties here for us to work through. And then there's this, Carlos. This is the hardest state, bar none, in which to vote. There's no online voter registration. There have been 750 polling place closures, twice as many as the closest state, and mostly concentrated in the fastest growing black and brown neighborhoods. You have what a 3-judge federal panel described as a racial gerrymander of our political jurisdictional lines, and you have the most onerous voter ID laws in the country. The Election Law Journal has ranked Texas dead last 50th in ease of voting. There's some real consequences to that. 7 million age-eligible Texans did not vote in 2020. So it means that we have to work a lot harder. It means that we have to stop current voter suppression efforts in the state legislature. But it also means that we need some federal help. And we are looking to President Biden, his administration, Democrats in the United States Senate, to ensure that we pass the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that will protect democracy, voting rights, and the ability for people to participate. If we have a level playing field, Carlos, I am confident that Democrats win this state. I think we can still win it, even against these obstacles and this voter suppression. It's just a lot harder, and it's going to take a little bit longer.
Beto, you've spoken about some of the things that have been successes in the first 100 days of the Biden presidency, but I want to ask about another issue, an issue that, as a congressman from Texas, a border state, I know is dear to your own heart, and that's immigration. In March, 18,800 unaccompanied children crossed the border from Mexico into the United States. They're being held in overcrowded facilities. They don't have what they need. The sanitation is not always good. There is COVID in those facilities. It's hard to see how you would describe that as a success.
I don't know how to put this in terms of victories or losses or political points scored or lost. We're talking about human beings and the very vulnerable among our fellow human beings who have just traveled 2,000 miles on foot, in buses, atop trains, not inside of them, surviving all types of predators along the way to come to this country to seek refuge and shelter. Having said that, and acknowledging that the Trump administration dismantled many of the shelters and infrastructure that could take care of and house these families who are in such desperate need, given the fact that President Biden ended the Remain in Mexico policy, given the fact that he's trying to honor our asylum laws, I think he's moving in the right direction. But I'll also say this. I really wish that he would make the Americas, the hemisphere that we are in, his top foreign policy priority. The level of misery that we are seeing in the Northern Triangle of Central America is unmatched. A violent landscape in part made possible by what happens here in the United States, whether it is our demand for illegal drugs, whether it is the drug war that we have foisted on the rest of this hemisphere, whether it's the climate change disasters that they are trying to survive. And there's been no country that has contributed more to climate change than this country. So these families are doing what they've got to do. And I'll say this, under President Trump, and we saw significant spikes in northbound crossing attempts, especially in 2019 under his administration, but folks were still coming north. It's just that they were stopped and living in the most hellish refugee camps in Ciudad Juarez, in Tijuana, in Nuevo Laredo, and other places. We're not going to resolve this at the border, whether with walls or whether with Joe Biden's current policy. We will resolve this once we take the underlying causes for this outmigration seriously.
And Beto, how do you look at where the economy is? And what would you say to people, particularly young people, who perhaps would say, yes, the economy is doing better, but that's because, we're essentially using our credit cards as a country, that we are spending trillions that we don't have. How would you respond to that?
It's certainly in a lot better position than it was this time a year ago. We're obviously coming out of this pandemic. We've exceeded the goals set by President Biden for the number of doses administered. That is certainly injecting confidence into this economy and into the job market. So we're moving in the right direction. The real test, Carlos, I think, is going to be in this $2.3 trillion jobs and infrastructure plan, which is also, of course, a main pillar of his climate strategy. If he can get this landmark legislation passed through both houses of Congress and signed into law, I think that's going to be fundamentally transformative to the American economy. I think over the long term, it's a very legitimate concern. In the short term, coming out of the deadliest pandemic of our lifetimes, the worst recession of our lifetimes, and the greatest set of global crises of the planet's lifetime, namely and chiefly among them, the climate, and the fact that money is so relatively cheap right now, the ability to borrow and fund these critically important programs, I think he's taking the right course. And if prosperity can be more equally shared in this country, if opportunity is more equally available, especially to those young people who want to know that they have a real future and real possibility in this country, that is going to do more than anything else to get our books balanced and to produce the kind of revenue and sustained growth that will allow us to pay down our debt and stop spending from a deficit position. It's not something that we can do immediately, and I think we need to meet the immediate challenges, which is going to require spending some money, but it is something over the long term, if we do the right things now, that we'll be able to solve for.
Beto, you told us at the beginning of this call as we were setting up that after this interview you're going to go and teach a class, and then tonight you are going to go and work on a telephone bank to get out votes. What are your plans? There's a lot of speculation that you're eyeing a run for governor of Texas. Are you making plans for a re-entry into political life?
I'll tell you what, I'm focused right now on these two courses I'm teaching at Texas State and the LBJ school at UT. And then the work that I'm doing with a volunteer organization called Powered by People. And that's the phone bank that I'll help lead this evening, calling into Laredo, Texas, which has one of the worst rates of voter turnout, to talk to those voters now in 2021 and not wait until 2022 when we may be asking for their vote, and trying to help get many more people registered. That's going to be the focus for the foreseeable future. At some point, I will think about whether there's something more I can contribute politically and potentially as a candidate for office, but no plans to do that now, and really no time, at least until this semester finishes, to really think about it. So that's the focus for the time being.
Beto, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. What an interesting moment to be having this conversation.
I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I wish the best for both of you.
Thank you, Beto.
Although Joe Biden won the presidency, Donald Trump got 10 million more votes than he did in 2016. So what are we likely to see from the Republican Party during Biden's time in office?
Joining us now is Jennifer Kearns, a Republican. She's a radio host, a political commentator, and a former Republican strategist. Jennifer served in the California government under Arnold Schwarzenegger, and she's been a spokeswoman for the California Republican Party. She says she is a fan of former President Trump and the majority of his policies. Jen, you've been listening into our conversation with Beto O'Rourke. What did you think of it?
You know, I thought it was a very honest conversation about the border crisis, which I think is no doubt Joe Biden's number one albatross around his neck at this point. What I think is interesting about Biden's first 100 days, if I may, is the approval ratings that are out this week. The fact that Joe Biden is polling at about 10 points below where his predecessor and former boss Barack Obama was at this point in his first 100 days is quite stunning. What I thought was interesting is that the two strongest polling numbers in Biden's favor were, number one, the vaccines, and number two, the economy bouncing back. Well, bouncing back to what? Bouncing back to the economy as it was under President Donald Trump. And you also look at the vaccines, and whether you're a fan of Donald Trump or not, and I understand many, many millions of people are not, Donald Trump could be credited for one thing, which is starting Operation Warp Speed last April 29th and really working and putting, $10 billion behind the production of the vaccines that now I think Joe Biden is getting credit for, because to the victor go the spoils.
Jen, I want to shift a little bit away from Biden for a moment to the Republican Party.
Sure.
Is this still Trump's party, or when I see Liz Cheney, the Republican Congresswoman and the number 3 Republican in the House of Representatives, are we beginning to see an evolution away from the former president?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. And I think a lot of that will depend upon what happens to Republicans in the midterms in 2022. I do think that Donald Trump still has a hold over the Republican base, in the same way that Sarah Palin had a hold over the Republican base after she was on the top of the ticket with John McCain. You might remember Sarah Palin for a good solid 18 months to 2 years. She was really the kingmaker. If people wanted to run for Congress or U.S. Senate, they would go to the Sarah Palin PAC to get the coveted endorsement. So I do think there is that sort of effect. We see people going down to Mar-a-Lago to have that photo op and to get that endorsement. But I think if the Trump endorsed candidates don't succeed in the 2022 elections, his star power will sort of dwindle. And I think that it will be at that point that Donald Trump himself will also think about whether he really has the juice to go on and run potentially again in 2024. There's no doubt about it, Carlos. He still has an incredible hold on the base. Whether or not that's good for the Republican Party, I don't think so in the long run. I don't know that those Trump-endorsed candidates are actually going to succeed in 2022, but time will tell.
Jen, you mentioned those polls, and when you dig down into them, there's actually a lot that Joe Biden is doing that is quite popular. Vaccine distribution, the spending on the stimulus bill, the infrastructure bill, they all get high approval ratings. If you were advising Mitch McConnell heading into the 2022 midterm elections, what would you advise him that his strategy should be?
I would focus on the policies that are really at the core of Joe Biden's soul and the things that he's putting forth. The largest spending program since FDR's era, 60% plus of American households still consider themselves fiscal conservatives. I would focus on those issues. I would focus on the issues that are far outside the mainstream of most American household values, things such as Joe Biden's gun control policies. Americans still cherish their Second Amendment rights to possess a firearm. And I think Joe Biden hits on that nerve with some of his policy proposals. I would also say some of the places that I think Joe Biden is actually getting pushed by the left wing of his party. He's being led down this path where they're promoting transgenderism. And if I were Republicans, I would focus on the out of control spending, and I would focus on some of those values that Joe Biden is pushing that are far too left, I think, even for Joe Biden. But I think he has to go there. He has to give some payback to the squad and some of the people that supported him and got him elected.
Jen, I want to turn you to 2024 a little bit, or even 2022. Should Republicans be playing up some of these cultural issues, whether we talk about questions of race, questions of gender? You hear this phrase now, woke. Is that a winning strategy, or is that something that Pat Buchanan and others tried 30 years ago and ultimately didn't prove successful for the party?
I do think it's a winning strategy. This woke war has now gone really to every household. 20, 30 years ago, when the right wingers, Pat Buchanan and the like, were pushing these issues, it really didn't trickle down to the average American household. But now you have people who have not been particularly politically engaged previously, but they're finding themselves banned on Facebook. They're finding that post they put on Twitter got taken down. The average American household now feels, and it's showing up in some of the polling, that there is a bias out there. And this was previously something that only really the elite political candidates could claim. This is only something, Donald Trump could pound on the desk about fake news, and it was a great platitude. But now you have the American people actually at their own little computer, their iPad, their cell phone, are now feeling that if they're not quite woke enough, that they are being squelched. That is a real, I think, shift in America that's happened in the last, 4 or 5 months that hadn't happened in the last 40 years. And this is something I'm watching very closely in terms of the public perception out there of free speech and what people can talk about in the political discourse in America.
Jen, that is so interesting. In fact, I think when we come back after our break, I think that is a show that we should address. Jen Kearns, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
We hope you've enjoyed this series of When Catty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and Aussie Media. Do subscribe to our podcast and you'll never miss an episode. We'll be back in late summer.
This is the BBC World Service with Kyoko Iwaki exploring the power of theatre during a global pandemic.
We're at an experimental theatre festival in Tokyo, connecting through new virtual reality technology.
I feel like I'm in the dream.
Or bringing voices from the nuclear disaster into the streets of Tokyo.
Fukushima and COVID pandemics are crossing over.
The Cultural Frontline, Monday at 9 GMT. And in 30 minutes, the Lazarus heist.
Imagine you were going to break into a bank and try to steal $1 billion. How would you pull it off?
Well, first you need to assemble the right crew. But then they took their crime online.
They turned the internet into a battleground,
leaving victims' lives in ruins.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello, I'm Nuala McGovern on the BBC World Service, and this is BBC OS, Conversations on Coronavirus, India. We want to highlight various experiences from the country as it is hit by a devastating second wave. Doctors in Mumbai and Delhi tell us about the emotions they're feeling, while journalists share what it's like to be reporting on the ground about the record number of deaths that are taking place.
All these things are very painful to see, and I was also a crime reporter. I reported 2002 riots also. I have seen many dead bodies also. I have seen murders. I have seen many things in my life. But everyone is so helpless.
We also hear from the young volunteers who are doing everything they can to help, from cooking and delivering food to sourcing oxygen canisters or hospital beds. That's BBC OS, Conversations on Coronavirus, India, all after the latest BBC News.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. India is launching an expanded vaccination programme as it struggles to tackle an escalating coronavirus crisis. From today, all adults are eligible to receive a first dose of the vaccine. But many states have closed vaccine centres because of a shortage of supplies. India is a global leader in vaccine manufacture and has exported millions of doses, but less than 10% of its population has had a first dose. Professor Srinath Reddy, the president of the Public Health Foundation of India, says vaccination for younger adults makes sense, but is fraught with difficulty.
The young people in the age group of 18 to 44 are likely to become super spreaders because of their high mobility. And secondly, recent data suggesting that some of the younger people are also getting seriously infected and are contributing to some of the deaths. The problem is related to the availability of adequate number of vaccines. About 1.2 billion doses of vaccine will be required. That is actually adding to serious logistical challenges.
Officials in the western Indian state of Gujarat say at least 18 people have died in a fire at a hospital treating COVID patients. About 50 survivors have been moved to other hospitals in the city of Bharuch. Australia has made it temporarily illegal for its citizens to return home from India, saying it wants to protect itself from the surge in coronavirus cases. From Monday, anyone who's been to India in the past 2 weeks cannot come home. If they break the new law, they face up to 5 years in prison and a large fine. Josh Frydenberg is the Australian Treasurer.
We're doing everything we can to support India at this very difficult time. We've also got to protect Australians. And the situation in India is dire and very serious. And we need to take and act on the medical advice that is provided to us. That's what we did at the start of the pandemic. That's what we're doing right through this pandemic.
Funerals are taking place today in eastern Afghanistan for the victims of a truck bombing that killed around 30 people and injured dozens more in Logar province. Sikandar Kamani reports.
Many of those who were killed in the blast in the city of Bole Alam were students preparing to take a university entrance exam. Members of a pro-government militia were also reportedly temporarily staying at the guest house. There are fears levels of violence in Afghanistan are going to increase yet further in the coming months. All remaining US and other NATO forces are being withdrawn by September. They were originally slated to leave by today, May the 1st, but President Biden pushed the deadline back, a move that the Taliban have criticized. With peace talks between the militants and Afghan government stalled, it seems inevitable the conflict will continue.
World News from the BBC. 11 people have been killed in China during a storm in which some people are reported to have been blown into the Yangtze River. 9 others went missing when their fishing boat overturned in the gale, which hit the city of Nantung on China's eastern coast. A video posted on social media showed the high winds spinning round a large passenger plane parked on the runway of the city's airport. The president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, has declared a state of siege in 2 eastern provinces that have suffered a wave of violence from armed groups. A government spokesman said the measure was intended to put a rapid end to the insecurity in the North Kivu and Ituri regions. The Colombian president Ivan Duque has announced that he will review a controversial tax reform proposal after 3 days of mass protests in cities across the country. But he insisted the reforms were crucial to balance the government's budget and guarantee the survival of important benefits and social projects. Trade unions say the changes are unfair and will affect mostly people already struggling financially because of the coronavirus pandemic. The organisers of the Grammy Awards have scrapped their anonymous voting committees following allegations of rigging. Emily Haller has more details.
For decades, Grammy nominations have been chosen by a small, secret group of experts, kept anonymous to stop them being influenced, but also shielding them from criticism. From now on, thousands of members will vote on the awards to try to make the process fairer. A former Grammys chief executive had claimed the voting process was corrupt, and several big music stars, including Zayn Malik and Halsey, have demanded transparency. The Canadian singer The Weeknd said he would boycott future ceremonies after he didn't receive any nominations in 2021. The awards have also been criticised for overlooking artists of colour.
And that's the BBC News.
Hello, I'm Nuala McGovern on the BBC World Service, and this is BBC OS, Conversations on Coronavirus, India. Amid a devastating second wave, journalists in the country share what it's like to report on the distressing numbers of deaths, and doctors discuss caring on the front line when there are essential shortages.
What we are seeing is already a disaster. I can't even imagine what can be worse than this. No oxygen to breathe. I mean, when did we ever hear of that?
India is a huge country with a population of 1.3 billion, but the latest coronavirus numbers can be hard to comprehend. In the last week alone, over 2 million people have been infected with coronavirus, and the numbers of deaths are so high that crematoriums and graveyards are struggling to cope. Makeshift funeral pyres, they are appearing, while in some places, wood for those is starting to become in short supply. We're also hearing about official daily deaths exceeding 3,000, yet the exact numbers, they're believed to be far higher. Countries are sending emergency medical equipment and supplies as the healthcare system is overwhelmed. But before we hear from two doctors trying to deal with that situation, I want to play you some messages we were sent from people in India sharing their experiences.
I'm Tarana Singh in New Delhi. I have lost some very close friends and fathers and mothers of close friends, a 9-year-old son of a friend, a grandfather of a friend. Most of these people have passed away not because of COVID, but because of a complication arising out of breathlessness, out of a lack of resource oxygen, a lack of hospitalization and hospital beds in time. These people could have been saved. These people would be alive today if the government could have set up a nationwide or even statewide helpline wherein we could call and get support for these emergency resources required. I would go crazy if I didn't have this situation of being a social worker, people turning and looking at me for help for their family members and friends. So I don't think I've slept in the last 8 days and 8 nights, maybe more than that. I don't even know. I've become like a robo. I'm barely sleeping 2 to 3 hours a night. I'm up till 4, 5 in the morning trying to secure, coordinate oxygen cylinders, an oxygen bed for a friend, for someone I haven't met. People are reaching out SOS. We don't even know each other, but we are trying to help each other. We are not coping. We are just surviving by some miracle until we drop.
Hello friend, myself Manish Rawat. I work in Patiala, Punjab. 7 days ago, I tested positive. I got fever 104 and coughing. I was completely in home quarantine as per state policy. I started to take zinc, vitamin C and Dolo accordingly. I am taking healthy food nowadays, coconut water, juice, having breathing exercise regularly. I am recovering slowly. My fever, my oxygen level, currently it's normal. I pray for all and recommend for vaccine and use mask with social distancing.
Hi, I'm Shweta Mishra from India.
I took my first dose of vaccine today, and I'm not sure how much of this vaccine will be helpful to me. My mother, 72-year-old lady, she was living in Bhopal all alone. She had already taken her first dose of vaccine, and still, after 1 week, she started showing symptoms. We had to take urgent travel to reach to her and then be there to help her. I'm thankful to God. We are blessed that she has recovered. 14 days have passed. Her fever has subsided and she is well. But everyone in the neighborhood is infected. Every relative of mine in Bhopal is infected with COVID and things are bad. People are crying for oxygen. Every WhatsApp message, every SMS message I see, it is like, can you help me with a bed in hospital? Where can I find oxygen support? Things are bad.
They are indeed, with so many moving accounts in recent days about these anguished searches for hospital beds and also oxygen. To hear about the situation in hospitals firsthand, we brought together two doctors. Dr. Vandana Goel, who works at a healthcare centre in Delhi. She's employed by the state government of Delhi. And Dr. Trupti Galada, who works in two hospitals in the city of Mumbai. Here's an extract of a video Dr. Trupti made after one of her shifts, which later went viral on social media.
मुझे इतना हेल्पलेस और लाचार कभी फील नहीं हुआ है. We have to literally manage patients at home with oxygen, and this is not something we are enjoying. So I really want all of you to follow a few things that I really am requesting you to follow. First, आप लोग प्लीज सेफ रहो. अगर आपको लग रहा है कि आपको 1 साल से कोरोना नहीं हुआ है, इसलिए आपको इस सुपर.
Dr. Trupti, tell me a little bit about why you felt you needed to create that video.
So I've been in and out of the COVID wards every single day since the last 1 year. And we've seen this so up close. Every day we have the emotion of victory and emotion of losing, because we have patients who recover and patients who obviously we lose. But the present scenario is such that besides what happens inside the hospital, what's stressful is what's happening outside. It's frantic calls from relatives, friends, people you've known probably for years, just calling for a bed, oxygen, medicines. Like absolutely basic needs that any good healthcare system should have been prepared for. So the video was actually prepared for a very close circle of family and friends, because amongst all the emotions that doctors have, I think one of the emotions that we have is fear. We're just seeing it from so up close, people losing their loved ones because they haven't been able to get them into the hospital on time, people losing loved ones at home without seeing the oxygen saturation drop in front of your eyes and not being able to provide oxygen. I think it's a helpless situation, and I really wanted to warn my family and friends that this is what I'm seeing, and it doesn't take too much to keep yourself protected from it. It's just simple things. Mask yourself, take the vaccine. And I think it did struck some chords with them, and it probably leaked out from one of these groups. Everyone knows at least some relative or some friend somewhere who's trying to get into a hospital. So I think we are all sailing in the same boat, hopefully which doesn't sink, and we are all trying to get to the shore. And we just hope we get there soon.
It is a dire situation. I think everybody can agree on that. I just want to read a little from a government statement that came out a little earlier. This is the government of Narendra Modi, ruling that all oxygen meant for industrial use would now be diverted to hospitals to meet the unprecedented demand. Indian Railways said they were all set to operate special trains, specially designed to carry liquid oxygen and oxygen cylinders, and these trains are dubbed the Oxygen Express. They say also thousands of COVID beds have been arranged in train carriages. This was in response to criticism over their handling of the healthcare system and COVID patients. Does that, Dr. Vandana, in any way reassure you?
We can only trust them, because what other option we have?
because I was also sitting with PPE kit on from 8 to 2 in my hospital, and some of the patients I had to refer to big hospitals with the big setup. I was just about to break down after seeing their conditions. So it really hurts being a doctor.
Yes, I'm
I'm
sure it
sorry.
must. No, I understand. It must be incredibly stressful. I
Yeah.
think even people that don't know anybody.
And we can't even switch on the AC because I'm sitting with my PPE kit from 8 to 2, afraid of the AC that it will increasing the atmosphere for the virus to enter the clinic. And then when we come home, then our family is also afraid, and we are also afraid that they might catch some infection.
So you're really at that point that you're really afraid that you might get sick yourself. Of course, you need
Yeah.
to be super careful. And I hadn't thought about that with the AC, but not turning it on for fear that it might spread. Let me turn back to you, Dr. Trupti. I mean, you can hear Dr. Vandana, what she's going through, and I imagine you must have some of the same fears. I did hear you say on the video that you feel COVID is everywhere.
Every other person around you is COVID positive. And what we fear is not testing positive. What we fear is getting a complication that may require a hospital bed. And in this present scenario, where it doesn't matter who you are, hospital beds are just in a very acute short supply. So, there are politicians and ministers and doctors who've been unable to get a bed for themselves. So it's just scary because we are in those COVID wards every day, and every day we come back home, we just pray that we don't bring that infection back home to our parents, our little children. And we just sail through this second wave before it strikes any of us. But it does strike some of us.
You know, I was reading in one of the newspaper headlines that it's not a wave in India, it's a wall. What would you respond to that?
I just hope that isn't true. I just hope that in the next 1 or 2 weeks, we just see that this is the peak and we start coming down again, because what we are seeing is already a disaster. I can't even imagine what can be worse than this. No oxygen to breathe. I mean, when did we ever hear of that? I cannot imagine of anything worse than this right now.
Let's hope things get better soon for Dr. Trupti Galada in Mumbai and Dr. Vandana Goel in Delhi. Our BBC colleagues in India, they're also among those witnessing the distressing circumstances. They're reporting on the coronavirus story while, like everyone else, dealing with the virus among their family, friends, and in their own communities. And they too talk of receiving frantic messages on their phones as people appeal for information and for help. We brought together 3 of our journalists to share their personal perspectives. Roxy Gagdekar works for BBC Gujarati in Ahmedabad. Mayank Bhagwat is with BBC Marathi in Mumbai. And Kinjal Pandya works at the BBC's bureau in Delhi. And she began by telling me how people are feeling in her city.
There's a lot of fear now. People are baffled, they are shocked to see the scenes that they're seeing through news media and hearing from their neighbors and families what's happening around them. Just 2 days ago, I lost a neighbor who lives in the next building. Pretty much every day, we have seen a record rise in total cases across the country. Deaths are rising very fast as well. Having said that, official figure, very clearly people can say, and we as journalists can say, that it's a portion or it's a fraction of what the reality is out there. When we source material, a couple of our reporters have also been to crematoriums, and what we have seen visually is clearly very different from what we get to read from official data.
Right. Roxy, I understand you lost your brother-in-law to COVID last year, so I'm very sorry for your loss and that you were coming up, I suppose, firsthand to what it is like to struggle with this crisis. It must be very difficult to report on a story while worrying about your own family members.
Yeah, the feeling is very bad when you see someone, losing their own loved ones. To see someone in that position, it's very painful. Death is certain. We know that everyone will have to die one day, but the death in this manner, in to several people, wherein people are denied from their basic health facilities. They are not able to get the basic medicines. Some of them, I have seen people struggling to get oxygen bottles right now. Even today, when I'm talking to you, few of my friends whose relatives are admitted in hospital, they are struggling to get even a single bottle of oxygen right now. They are moving from pillar to post to refill those oxygen bottles. Hospitals are admitting the people only on the condition that oxygen has to be managed by the relative, because hospitals don't have the steady supply of oxygens. All these things are very painful to see. And I was also a crime reporter. I reported 2002 riots also. I have seen many dead bodies also. I have seen murders. I have seen many things in my life as a reporter. But everyone is so helpless. Nothing can be done in some situation.
Let us turn, Roxy, thank you for that, to Mayank in Mumbai. And I'm wondering if you find it difficult to go out and speak to people when you know the virus may be all around you.
No, to be frank, it's a frightening situation if you want to go on the field and report. Always the concern is there in back of the mind that what will happen to my family if I am stepping out on the field, and every day if that happens, then how I keep my family safe. In Mumbai, especially, is a sense of helplessness. Number of people call me up for bed availability. Number of people call me up for remdesivir and tocilizumab injection availability. But the issue is the entire system is on a verge of collapsing, and the sense of helplessness is not only amongst the journalists like me, but doctors are feeling helpless too.
I understand. Let me turn back to you, Mayank. How would you describe the role of WhatsApp in this crisis?
The way social media works, it is a double-edged sword. On one hand, you have social media like WhatsApp playing a major role in terms of helping people, as there are a number of groups in Maharashtra which have registered or which are navigating people to find plasma donor from them. People are navigating to find oxygen bed or I would say isolation bed for them. But on the other hand, you have all sort of misinformation which has been peddled on WhatsApp, especially about the vaccine and their efficacy. People were not coming forward to take vaccine, and that is why vaccine hesitancy was also developed.
There's a big pool of misinformation out there still about remedies for coronavirus. There are videos of taking steam to heal coronavirus, or, like if you take steam, you'll never get coronavirus. All sorts of messages out
Which
there.
is not true. I'll just underline
Which is
that.
not true. Yes, yes. Just yesterday, one of my relatives was telling me over the phone that, oh, have you watched this video where a person is explaining that these masks have some kind of inbuilt germ that can actually get you coronavirus? Don't trust this kind of videos, coming from random sources. As one doctor very rightly pointed out, that we have now gone from vaccine hesitancy to vaccine desperation. Yesterday, we had this big editorial meeting talking about our COVID coverage and the kind of stories we should do, what is it that we have not covered. And one very senior journalist who is obviously getting SOS calls from various people who know him, he said that, for me, I have reached a stage where just telling the story is no more important. For me, it's important to save lives. Whoever is calling me, I'm trying my best to help them out in terms of getting a hospital bed or drugs or oxygen. So it's reached that level where we really feel that, we actually want to get out and help people. We want to do what we can in real terms to save lives.
BBC journalists and Indians Kinjal Pandey, Roxy Gagdekar and Mayank Bhagwat. The urge to take action is understandable, and many Indians are volunteering to help neighbours and strangers during the pandemic, especially those who are unwell or are isolating. For some, this means finding and sharing oxygen supplies. For others, it's organising food deliveries. Let's speak to two volunteers from Delhi, Lakshmi Mittal, a software developer, and publisher Karnika Kohli.
I was just scrolling and I just felt really helpless. So I thought the least I can do is I can send food across to people who are quarantining, because the last thing you want to do when you're that sick is to have to cook for yourself also. Yeah, so I just tweeted about it, and then I received an overwhelming response. And since then I've been sending food to 20-25 people every day, and there's actually a lot more people who need it, but I have my limitations, so I'm only able to help very few.
So tell me a little bit about that. Do you have to get up early and then start all this business of trying to
No,
provide
so
for others?
it was a little overwhelming, but when I actually the prep work and everything just requires 2 hours. So I do get up early. I get up around 6 a.m. and then I cook and then I keep it because it's really hot in Delhi right now. So you can't really keep the food outside. So I don't want to send them food that has gone bad. So I make sure that I cook just at hours before I have to send. And then around 12:30, I just start sending food out to all the people who have told me that, usually people just send me the number of people who require food. I don't have a menu. I just make dal, sabzi and rice.
How are you getting the food to people? Because, delivering to 20 plus people is not easy. Are people paying you?
No, I'm not charging anyone for the food. That's the least I can do. Earlier, I was using the service called Dunzo. It's basically you can sort of hire someone to run errands for you. But then, as you might know, there's a curfew in Delhi right now. So then I created a link. It's an app called Swiggy. And so people just need to put their address and pay for the delivery fees and they get the food.
Karnika, we've been able to connect also with Lakshmi Mittal, who's a software developer. She's also in your city of Delhi. Tell me a little bit, Lakshmi, about what you decided to do to try and help.
We are providing oxygen cylinders and arranging hospital beds, calling every hospital, checking the availability of beds, food, everything for the patient.
And how, Lakshmi, can you do that? Because we keep hearing about that there is no oxygen supplies, that black market prices are highly inflated.
If one distributor have a capacity of 200 liters oxygen, people are panicking, and instead of reaching 200 people, they are trying to create a crowd, and that's how people are panicking. There are a lot of shops available. If I'll go to just one shop and every person will visit the one shop only, then definitely the resources will be in crisis.
Okay, so you're saying that there is a supply out there, but everybody is going to the same provider, and then so you get this backlog or kind of a jamming up of the system, I think is what you're saying, where you're trying to spread it out among the people who need it.
Exactly. What our job is that we are trying to connect people with the distributors by dividing the crowd.
But I'm wondering as well, Lakshmi, when you hear of all this need, does that scare you really about the situation in your country?
Yes, it scares me very much. In night, when I'm trying to sleep, and if somebody calls me and said that my father died and I need bed for my mom, otherwise I will be orphaned, that actually scares me.
And that is a call that you got?
Yes, every day I'm receiving these type of calls.
Were you able to help that person?
Yes, thanks to God.
On a personal level, it's scary, and then you get requests, right? You want people to message you and they ask you to amplify or they ask you to connect, and there's this sense of helplessness you feel, and there's anger and there's sadness, and then there's just too much, right? And you need to be able to process it, but there's just so much of it going on right now. I was actually joking with a friend the other day, and I told her that I wake up in the morning and do a pre-crying before scrolling through Twitter just to prepare myself. Today itself, I was reading someone had tweeted how they were looking for a hospital bed for their uncle, and then a couple of hours later, they tweeted that he died outside a hospital in an ambulance. I mean, what do you even say to that person?
Lakshmi Mittal and Karnika Kohli, both in Delhi, and among the young volunteers who are doing their very best to help people in whatever way they can during their terrible second wave. Hopefully, their selfless acts won't be required for too much longer. I'm Nuala McGovern, and this is BBC OS, Conversations on Coronavirus, India. This is the BBC World Service, and for the next World Book Club, Harriet Gilbert is talking to Louise Penny about still life.
Miss Jane Neal met her maker in the early morning mist of Thanksgiving Sunday. It was pretty much a surprise all around.
This month, we've been reading an international bestseller.
I sat down and I created characters I would want to hang around with because I knew it would take me a few years to write the book, which it did.
A detective novel set in an apparently friendly, peaceful little village, but one where rage and violence quietly hiss beneath the surface.
The murder in a small community is absolutely shattering. So that's what I wanted to bring, was that sense of we aren't safe. The ground is shifting beneath us all the time, and what that does to relationships.
Canadian author Louise Penny joins me to talk about Still Life.
World Book Club, today at 11 GMT.
Welcome to The Lazarus Heist on the BBC World Service. I'm Jeff White, and with my co-host Jean Lee, we've been investigating one of the world's most dangerous computer hacking gangs, the Lazarus Group. They've hit hospitals, banks, even a Hollywood studio. Investigators say they're working for a nation-state, North Korea. How did a tiny country with limited internet access become a hacking superpower? Join us on The Lazarus Heist after the news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. India is launching an expanded vaccination programme as it struggles to tackle an escalating coronavirus crisis, reporting more than 400,000 new infections in the last 24 hours. From today, all adults over the age of 18 are eligible to receive a first dose of the vaccine. But many states, including some of the worst affected, have closed vaccine centres because of a shortage of supplies. Australia has banned its own citizens from returning from India and will jail anyone who tries due to the severity of the coronavirus wave. Canberra had already paused direct flights from India to reduce outbreaks in its hotel quarantine system. The president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, has declared a state of siege in 2 eastern provinces that have suffered a wave of violence from armed groups. The government spokesman said it's intended to put a rapid end to the insecurity in the North Kivu and Ituri regions. The US and its NATO allies are today starting to withdraw troops from Afghanistan after an engagement there which has lasted nearly 20 years. Late on Friday, an international meeting of representatives from Afghanistan, the US, China, Russia and Pakistan issued a joint statement calling for peace during the withdrawal period. It will be completed by September the 11th. 11 people have been killed in China during a storm in which some people are reported to have been blown into the Yangtze River. A video posted on social media showed the high winds spinning round a large passenger plane parked on an airport runway in the city of Nantung. The organisers of the Grammy Awards have scrapped their anonymous voting committees following allegations of rigging. Nominations and winners for next year's event will now be chosen by thousands of members instead of small unnamed groups. BBC News.
This is the BBC World Service. You know all those movies you thought were made in Hollywood? Gone with the Wind, The Matrix, Ben-Hur? Well, they weren't filmed in Hollywood at all. They were actually shot across town in an area of Los Angeles County called Culver City. That's where you'll find the old MGM film lot. This place is huge and it's legendary. And there are these 2 white arched gates at the front. Step through them and you're in Fantasyland.
The first thing you see is this massive rainbow sculpture. It's an homage to one of my favorite movies, The Wizard of Oz. And all around you are these mammoth billboards showcasing upcoming movie releases, and also these towering facades that are painted like shops. A dry cleaner, a bowling alley, a movie marquee.
You can go on a public tour of the place, and they still make TV programmes on the lot, so there's always a chance of glimpsing a star or two as you mooch around. And there are movie-themed rides to go on as well. But away from the glitz, the MGM lot is a workplace like any other. It's the HQ of Sony Pictures Entertainment. Behind the buzz of the sound stages and celebs, hundreds of Sony's employees keep the place ticking. Among them,
Selena Chavanette, how to describe me, a super awesome person all the time.
Selena's in a glamorous workplace, yes, but her job's kind of mundane.
It sounds fancy being in Hollywood, but it's really just being in a cubicle, working on the computer. So yeah, it's a lot of computer work and spreadsheets.
But the perks are pretty sweet.
Like on your breaks or lunchtime, you get to go walk around and like you could see sets and productions. I'm very social, so I would walk around and talk to everybody and then try to get on the set. Like I got to tour the Jeopardy set, and I got in trouble a bunch of times hanging out at the shark where Jaws is on the ride. I'll go places until people tell me no.
Then on Monday the 24th of November 2014, something strange happens.
It was weird to try and get into the office because I was like, I can't scan my badge to get in.
It doesn't seem like a big deal at first. Her security badge suddenly stops working, so she has to get signed in by the security guards. But that broken badge turns into a big headache.
They networked everything. Your badge was basically your key to get anywhere. So you had to scan your badge driving in the lot. You had to scan it to get into the building, scan it to get into the rooms. And so I was like, oh, well, this is interesting.
And it isn't just Selena's badge, it's everyone's. And it's not just the doors that are out of action. Something is going haywire with the technology at the heart of Sony's giant global entertainment operation.
No computers were on. Everybody that was in the office was just kind of talking to each other, trying to figure out what was going on, waiting for like Xerox people to come in and take off the network for the copy machines.
So that you could photocopy things?
You can at least fax stuff. We went analog style.
So you couldn't even fax or photocopy anything? Even that fairly low-tech thing was off limits?
Yeah, because they just like a couple weeks before, they just networked all of the printers and the copy machines, and we couldn't do it.
Those broken printers are just a hint of the damage that's about to unfold. Selena's employer is now the target of a meticulously planned digital assault, and it's got one aim: annihilate Sony Pictures Entertainment.
A few days before Selena's pass stopped working, senior executives at Sony had received a very strange email from someone calling himself Frank David. And that email said,
"We have got great damage by Sony Pictures. The compensation for it, monetary compensations we want. Pay the damage, or Sony Pictures will be bombarded as a whole. You know us very well. We never wait long. You better behave wisely."
Right, so you've got vague threats issued in dodgy English. That sounds like classic spam email, doesn't it? But the message is real. Someone is about to do Sony very great damage indeed. A virus is sweeping through the company's network, disabling computer after computer. 3 days later, when Sony employees log into their machines, things get a bit bizarre.
One by one, a horror film image of a blood-red skeleton with fangs and glaring eyes takes over their screens. An image that's as cheesy as it is threatening. And if that isn't scary enough, there are sound effects to go with it.
Superimposed over the skeleton on screen is an ominous message that reads,
"Warning. We've already warned you, and this is just the beginning. We continue till our request be met. We've obtained all your internal data, including your secrets and top secrets. If you don't obey us, we'll release data shown below to the world."
The data consists of 5 links, and if you click on them, you get lists of folders containing incredibly sensitive information. We're talking executive salaries, confidential internal emails, insider gossip. It's the kind of embarrassing dirty laundry that no company wants out there. There are also details of as yet unreleased films, and whoever sent the message is threatening to leak them.
The skeleton graphics, the over-the-top sound effects. This looks like some kind of prank from a horror movie, but the attack is deadly serious. It's the opening salvo in a battle to destroy Sony Pictures.
And by the end, half of its global digital network will be wiped out. Some of the most powerful players in Hollywood will lose their jobs, and the digital break-in will spark an international incident.
The hacking gang behind the attack are one of the most dangerous in the world. They've earned themselves a nickname: the Lazarus Group. They're named after the biblical figure who was brought back from the dead. And once Lazarus Group get inside their victims' computers, it's very hard to kill them off. Sony is just the start for them. They'll go on to stage one of the most audacious cybercrimes the world has ever seen, a bank heist targeting $1 billion.
These attackers have no fear.
How in the world did this happen?
No one in their right mind, no cybercriminal had tried to transfer $1 billion from a bank.
A terrifying incident, probably one of the most terrifying that I've ever seen.
It was astounding.
From the BBC World Service, this is The Lazarus Heist. I'm Jeff White.
And I'm Jean Lee.
I've been investigating cybercrime for more than a decade, and in my world, the Lazarus Group are kind of legendary. It's not just Sony. They've been breaking in all over the world in all sorts of places. Banks, TV stations, even hospitals. They're dangerous because they're unpredictable. You never know where they'll strike next, and they don't seem to care about getting found out. There are lots of cybercrime gangs, of course there are, but according to investigators, the Lazarus Group is different. They're working for a nation state, North Korea. And that doesn't seem to make any sense, right? This is a tiny, desperately poor country where most people can't even access the internet. So the question I had was, how come this place, of all countries, has become a computer hacking superpower? How do they operate? And what's driving them? And that's where Jean comes in.
I'm not a cyber expert, but I know North Korea. So I started reporting there in 2008, and I was the first American journalist to open a news bureau in Pyongyang. And in my years there, I saw a huge change. I saw the new leader, Kim Jong-un, making big new investments in science and technology. Computers, mobile phones. Now, Kim claims he's just trying to modernize North Korea for his country's economic survival. But reporting on North Korea often means trying to get past the propaganda, and sometimes there are sinister, more dangerous motives. Kim is training a new generation of cyber warriors. These are young computer whizzes who can hack into places that are supposed to be secure. I wanted to know what they were up to and why.
Episode 1, The Interview.
Who would be right to play me? That's a good question. You need to have like a somewhat classic neurotic, sort of a balding guy. I'd love somebody like 20 pounds thinner than me.
That's Dan Sterling. He's a screenwriter, and he's worked on some of the most provocative comedies around, from South Park to The Daily Show.
I come from a long line of feather-ruffling writers and activists. The things that most interest me are things that are political in nature, and it's only fun if it's provocative.
Dan had been working with writer-actor Seth Rogen and writer-producer Evan Goldberg, who between them were behind a string of comedies like Knocked Up and Sausage Party. So not exactly highbrow stuff, right, but very successful. And back in the late 2000s...
Seth and Evan came to me with this very rudimentary idea. The logline was, what if, and this was when Osama bin Laden, I think, was still alive. They said, what if you were a journalist and you got an interview with Osama bin Laden? Would you kill him during the interview?
Dan really likes the idea, but he's aware there's already a comedy in development featuring a Middle Eastern leader called The Dictator, starring Sacha Baron Cohen.
So I started kicking around for ideas like, well, all right, if it's not bin Laden, who is epic enough that will make it feel world stakes level enough? And then I had a drink with a friend. He's like, oh, it's got to be North Korea. And I was like, oh, yes, of course it does.
And that one tiny decision changed everything. At first, Dan says it hadn't occurred to him to use the North Korean leader's real name.
I just made up a name that sounded like his, and it was obviously a stand-in for him, but it wasn't until much later that I was sitting in a trailer with Seth and Evan and some executives, and they said, we just want to try this. What would happen if you changed it out from your fictitious name to Kim Jong-un? And as soon as they said it, I thought, of course, that is so much edgier. It's just much more provocative and much more titillating to take a swat at the real person. And why not? I mean, it did not seem very controversial at the time to mock one of the world's most dastardly living people. And it was only very shortly before we started shooting that the studio suggested, you know what, let's not do that. That might be a bit too provocative. But at that point, Seth and Evan and I were all pretty invested, and Seth and Evan are pretty powerful guys, and they pushed back.
And soon enough, the actor Randall Park is chosen to play the role of Kim Jong-un. He is the real-life millennial leader of North Korea who came to power in December 2011.
He interpreted Kim Jong-un as this insecure, bashful guy who, you know, is very vulnerable and is very sort of awestruck by American celebrities.
Hey, thank you. So you really like the show? You know, I might not show it, but I'm freaking out. You're like a super fan. I really am. Yeah. That's so cool. Don't say something stupid, Kim.
The plot takes shape. The main characters are a TV host, played by James Franco, and his producer, played by Seth Rogen. They discover that Kim Jong-un is a fan of their show, and that's how they manage to secure an interview with him.
And then suddenly they're on the world stage hyping up this big, you know, one-on-one interview, the first interview with the leader of North Korea. But as they're preparing for it, they're approached by the CIA.
You want us to assassinate the leader of North Korea?
Yes.
What? And then when they get to North Korea, what happens is Kim Jong-un is charming, and he and James Franco sort of have a bromance.
I'm 31 years old. The fact that I'm running a country is crazy. What am I to do when 24 million people look to me as their leader, their God? What am I to do when my father's dying wish was for me to carry his torch?
The bromance comes to an end when Franco's character discovers that he's been lied to. Spoiler alert, he does kill Kim Jong-un. His death is portrayed in slow motion, and it's graphic and it is brutal.
Boom, boom, yeah!
And yes, it's an actor playing Kim Jong-un, but the movie does show the killing of a sitting head of state.
And this isn't just any head of state we're talking about. Jean, to say that North Korea's rulers in particular are a bit touchy about their appearance would be a massive understatement, right?
Oh, absolutely. The image of the Kims is considered sacrosanct. I mean, they are treated like gods in their country. They say the Kims are descended from Mount Paektu, and this is a revered mountain in the very far north. That's the mountain that the Koreans believe this mythical figure, Dangun, is said to have descended as well. He was half bear, according to the mythology. And he's said to have founded ancient Korea 5,000 years ago. And because the Kims are said to have been descended from Mount Paektu like Dangun, they say that they're endowed with not superpowers quite, but extraordinary abilities. They say that the skies crack open when the Kims are born. You know, and when I interviewed children, they told me Kim Jong-un was a genius from the time of birth, and he was so precocious that he was driving a car at age 3. Kim Jong-il, the first time he played golf, hit a hole-in-one. So just these extraordinary capabilities that set them apart from average, ordinary, everyday North Koreans.
I heard that if you have a newspaper with one of the Kim's pictures on it, you're not allowed to throw it in the dustbin in North Korea. You have to hand it to an official who can then sort of dispose of that.
That was one of the first things I was told by the North Koreans on my first trip to North Korea, is that if you get a newspaper or magazine, don't crumple it up. Like, we might crumple up a newspaper and throw it in the bin. And they were like, absolutely do not do that. Just gently lay it on top of the bin, because crumpling up or desecrating the image of the leader in any way would be considered or could be considered an anti-state crime.
And so I can probably guess the answer to this, bearing in mind what we just talked about. What would the North Korean regime make of a film showing the assassination of Kim Jong-un?
So to depict Kim Jong-un's assassination would be considered a crime of the highest magnitude, and that would, I would guess, be punishable by death. And not just a quiet death, but very likely a public execution, in which the accused would be obliterated by anti-aircraft artillery.
Wow, so perhaps understandably, before they release this film, The Interview, Sony begins to ask for advice about it.
Sony goes to a defense expert at the Rand Research Institute for advice, and then Sony decides to go ahead with the assassination scene, but they tone it down to make it less grisly. And by the end of the summer of 2014...
Posters were going up and billboards were going up all over town.
And the trailer leaves no doubt as to the plot of Dan Sterling's script.
Want to go kill Kim Jong-un?
Totally. I'd love to assassinate Kim Jong-un. It's a date.
Find out what happens next week on The Lazarus Heist. The Lazarus Heist is presented by me, Jeff White, and Jean Lee. Our producer is Estelle Doyle. You can hear much more about the story in our podcast. Search for The Lazarus Heist wherever you get your podcasts, and if your app allows it, please do leave us a rating or review. Thank you.
It's time to hear what you think of the BBC World Service in Over to You. This week, the challenges of reporting the crisis in India as COVID infections devastate the country. We hear from the BBC's Delhi bureau. Plus, more of your feedback on the BBC's coverage of the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. I'm Rajan Datta, and this is Over to You.
The sight of patients gasping for oxygen as they wait outside packed hospitals, as well as the endless funeral pyres, has resonated globally. The health system has
In the emergency ward of the Holy Family Hospital, things are frantic. More than 60 patients are...
Hi, this is Sonia Bal from Singapore. India. How acute and heartbreaking is India's plight right now? One watches in abject horror and helplessness from afar. I still have family, friends, and loved ones there. I've been following your reports and reporters closely, and I feel nothing but a sense of deep gratitude for their honest, brave, and their non-partisan reporting.
Hello, over to you. It's Rob McKnight in San Diego, California, USA. And I'm absolutely fascinated and baffled by the coverage, in particular the contributing factors in India, where it's just so tough to get people vaccinated.
Hello, over to you. This is Pradeep from Bengaluru, India. Hats off to the journalists who are not only on the spot risking their health for the coverage, but are also struggling to get us an accurate picture of the ground realities when authentic information is very hard to come by. In these times, when there is so much of unverified and inaccurate information doing the rounds, the responsibility of journalists, I think, is far greater. It would be great to get a more pan-Indian picture from the BBC. Reports from other states where the situation is vastly different. After all, this is a huge country and every state is a lot different from the other.
Well, joining me on the line now from the BBC's Delhi bureau is one of the editors there, Vandana Vijay. Hello, Vandana.
Hello from Delhi.
You've been very much the centre of global attention recently, albeit for unfortunate reasons, but, that's the nature of news, I guess. But tell me, and tell all of us, what are the challenges and pressures faced by BBC correspondents and producers in reporting this crisis?
It's an absolutely unprecedented situation. To put it another way, it's almost like a war that's going on, and it's very difficult time for journalists as well, both for the journalists who are on ground, because if they are going to the hospitals and these locations, obviously they are exposing themselves to catching hold of the virus. And absolutely, this is a frightening situation for any journalist and their family. But also, it's not easy for the people who are coming into offices every single day, the producers, the video editors, the graphics people, because they have to see these really disturbing videos and pictures throughout the day, day after day, week after week. And it can really be difficult to handle emotionally and, mentally as well.
What do you say to listener Pradeep who says it would be great to get more of a pan-Indian picture from the BBC and reports from other states where the situation is vastly different? Obviously, basically saying there that India is a huge country and wondering if you're limited to reporting on too much in Delhi.
Absolutely. So BBC has been extensively covering the corona story all across India. BBC, with the help of its Indian languages, has been bringing stories even from the remote parts of India, and as I rightly said, that in other states which may be in a different situation. And there is this heartbreaking story from the northern city of Varanasi. It's a very famous tourist center otherwise, where a mother was forced to carry her dead son in an e-rickshaw after failing to get an ambulance. We somehow traced, that picture went viral actually, so we somehow managed to trace her and spoke to her and, bring her ordeal to the wider audiences, not just in India, but, even outside India. So we have been getting to all the impacted states wherever we can. So all this is being covered, be it North India, South India. It's not very Delhi-centric. It's just that the last few days have been very hard on Delhi.
Hello, over to you. This is Rupinder Sial from Jalandhar city of Punjab province of northern India. I would like to commend the journalists and medical personnel involved in saving thousands of lives who are suffering from COVID-19 across India. I would like to mention that instead of uniting at this critical point and saving people's lives, political parties are involved in either political vendetta, blaming each other for the crisis, or silencing critics who are blaming government for their apathy and lack of medical facilities.
Okay, what do you say to the point made by Rupinder that political parties are simply involved in infighting? And he's wondering how easy is it for you to hold the government accountable for their actions? Because I know you've had problems before with trying to get answers from the government.
There is no doubt there is a general sense of anger amongst a certain section of people against politicians in general, because recently there were elections in some of the states in India, and there were a lot of election rallies with big crowds, and people have been asking that why so when the situation is so grim. And also there has been some anger against the government as well, that they have not done enough as anticipating that this is going to happen. But at the same time, BBC, as I said, as an independent public broadcaster, has been trying to and speaking to government officials, especially the health ministry officials in various states, about what is the latest situation, what are the mitigating factors they are taking. For example, in the northern state of Punjab, where he belongs to, the government has claimed that there is no shortage of beds or oxygen, but we have been reporting that people are struggling to find oxygen and are being forced to buy in black market at like almost 10 times the price. And we are trying to, put it across to all the government officials wherever we have to.
Vandana, it must be a really, really difficult time for you. I wish you the best of luck. Thank you to you, Vandana, Vijay, and to everybody who contributed. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, what else have you been writing about? Well, we've had this following last week's programme.
Hello, over to you. This is Fern Cunningham in New York City. I was surprised by some of the feedback on the death of Prince Philip. Several respondents suggested that the BBC's coverage of the death of the Queen's husband of 73 years was excessive. As an American listener and a person of color, I tuned in specifically for that type of extended coverage, and I expected no less from an organization called the British Broadcasting Corporation. In my opinion, the coverage was informative and appropriate for the occasion, and perhaps those listeners who found it excessive should have switched to some other streaming service for the day.
Hello, over to you. This is Mette in Denmark. I really enjoy the international perspective of BBC World, and that actually gave me an idea for a suggestion to BBC to maybe establish a panel of randomly selected listeners who could help bounce off ideas and inspire BBC for how to make priorities. This came out of the debate last week, where some listeners complained of too much coverage of the death of Prince Philip, and I completely agree with that assessment.
And if you want to let us know what you think of what you hear on the BBC World Service, please do get in touch.
Email over to you at bbc.co.uk, or you can tweet at over to you BBC.
And with that, it's time to say goodbye. I'm Rajan Datta, the producer is Howard Shannon, and we'll be back with more of your feedback at the same time next week.
This is the BBC World Service. Jeff White and Jean Lee investigate a gang of wanted cybercriminals.
Warning, this is just the beginning.
In 2014, the entertainment world was rocked by a huge hacking scandal. Investigators say the Lazarus Group was behind the attack.
No cybercriminal had tried to transfer $1 billion. It was astounding.
Uncover the story of what happened next.
The Lazarus Heist. Sunday at 21:30 GMT. And at bbcworldservice.com, Crowd Science with Marnie Chesterton.
We're digging into our listener Charles's question, why are seeds such different sizes? We'll hear how these little capsules of life fit into Earth's biodiversity and pay a visit to the remote island home of the world's biggest seed.
Sports Hour is next, here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up on Sports Hour on the BBC World Service with me, Caroline Barker. He was the #1 draft pick, but the sport nearly cost him his life.
I developed an infection that turned into necrotizing fasciitis, fancy term for flesh-eating bacteria.
It is a truly horrific story, that of NFL quarterback Alex Smith, who joins us to talk about his ultimate comeback and about being #1 as the future stars of the sport take part in the draft. Also on the show, the Olympic hopeful who got back on the bike.
14-year-old me was literally thinking I was going to be trapped in my parents' house for the rest of my life.
BMX star Nikita Ducaro on finding freedom in freestyle. Plus, we're at the snooker finals and the football, and I get to rub noses with a therapy bunny who also just happens to be the biggest sports fan on the planet. No, really. That and plenty more when Sports Hour starts in 5 minutes.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. India is launching an expanded vaccination programme as it struggles to tackle a worsening coronavirus crisis. From today, all adults over 18 are eligible to receive a first dose of the vaccine. But many states have closed vaccine centres because of a shortage of supplies. The president of the Public Health Foundation of India, Professor Srinath Reddy, told the BBC the authorities had failed to make contingency plans for any local surge, resulting in the current shortages.
I think our miscalculation, which it undoubtedly was based on the presumption that there wouldn't be a second wave, that we could have a slow and steady vaccination program. So I think this graduated approach has been a problem because we did not plan our vaccine requirements based on that. Now that there is a sudden surge, we are suddenly caught short of our vaccine stocks.
South Asian communities in England have been found to be more at risk of infection, severe illness and death during the second wave of the pandemic than other ethnic groups. The discovery came in new research, as Jim Reid explains.
It has confirmed that nearly all ethnic minority groups were disproportionately affected by the first wave of COVID up to September, with higher rates of hospital admissions and deaths. In the second wave, the differences for people from a black or mixed ethnic background narrowed compared with those who said they were white. But for South Asian communities, the opposite was true. Differences widened, especially for those from a Pakistani or Bangladeshi background. Researchers said a higher prevalence of other health conditions could be one reason for that, along with a greater number living in larger, multi-generational households.
The US and its NATO allies are today starting to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, ahead of a deadline of September the 11th, after nearly 20 years of engagement. There's been an international call for peace during the withdrawal period. But Taliban attacks are continuing, as Sikandar Kamani reports.
There are fears levels of violence in Afghanistan are going to increase yet further in the coming months. All remaining US and other NATO forces are being withdrawn by September. They were originally slated to leave by today, May the 1st, but President Biden pushed the deadline back, a move that the Taliban have criticized. With peace talks between the militants and Afghan government stalled, despite the drawing down of international involvement, it seems inevitable the conflict will continue.
The president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, has declared a state of siege in 2 eastern provinces that have suffered a wave of violence by armed groups. The government says it wants a rapid end to insecurity in the North Kivu and Ituri regions. World News from the BBC. 11 people have been killed in China during a storm in which some people are reported to have been blown into the Yangtze River. 9 others were missing when their fishing boat overturned in the gale, which hit the city of Nantung on China's eastern coast. The Pentagon says the Biden administration is cancelling the construction of Donald Trump's wall along the US-Mexican border. A spokesman said this would free up money for other construction projects by the US military, such as schools for the children of soldiers. Building the wall on the border with Mexico was a key policy of Mr. Trump, which he argued was needed to stop illegal immigration. New research has found that about 1,000 rivers are responsible for most of the plastic waste in the world's oceans. Rivers are the main way discarded plastic gets into the sea. Here's our science editor, David Shokman.
Plastic has been found in tiny creatures in the deepest corners of the oceans. It kills seabirds and turtles, and more is being added all the time, up to 2.7 million tons every year, according to this new study. It had been thought that most of it came from 10 of the world's largest rivers, mainly in Asia. But researchers have looked again at what happens to the bottles, bags and containers that are thrown away in towns and cities around the world. And they now reckon that 1,000 rivers carry about 80% of the plastic waste that ends up in the sea.
David Shokman. The organisers of the Grammy Awards have scrapped their anonymous voting committees following allegations of rigging. Nominations and winners for next year's event will now be chosen by thousands of members instead of small, unnamed groups. Several big music stars, including Zayn Malik, had claimed the selection process was unfair. Artists of colour have long criticised the awards for a lack of diversity. BBC News.
Hello everyone and welcome along to Sports Hour here on the BBC World Service with me, Caroline Barker, your regular guide to the stories behind the week in sport. Coming up on this week's eclectic journey, we've everything from the NFL draft to a rabbit at the baseball, who incidentally has been to more sport than me this last year. And it's not just furry fans on the show. We've live football and snooker. And in Sporting Witness, we meet American college wrestler Anthony Robles, whose success was all the more remarkable because he achieved it with only one leg. Plus, we'll speak to BMX star Nikita Ducaro on how riding helped her deal with anxiety.
Even something as little as like going to the grocery store would just make me completely freak out. Like 13, 14. I'd stopped going to school. I was doing school at home. Any sort of outing was just like a big ordeal.
That's just a taster then of what's coming up in the next hour. But we start with the NFL draft. The glitz and glamour of selecting the next best American football star. It's been taking place this week, and there's always a number one pick.
With the first pick in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Jacksonville Jaguars select Trevor Lawrence, quarterback, Clemson.
As it said on the tin, that's Clemson Tigers quarterback Trevor Lawrence on his way to Jacksonville. The National Football League draft is where teams select newly eligible players, like Trevor, for their rosters. To be eligible, a player must be out of high school at least 3 years. Alex Smith was the first overall pick in the 2005 draft. He went on to be a star of the game, but has just called time on his career after being named Comeback Player of the Year. And what a comeback. In 2018, Alex suffered a serious leg injury in a game against the Houston Texans, which left doctors fighting to save his life. What followed was 2 years of rehab, countless surgeries, and question marks over whether he would ever play again. I should warn you that some of what you're about to hear you may find distressing.
On a routine play, I got sacked and I had a compound fracture of my right leg on my tib fib. Had surgery that day and they put in 3 plates and something like 28 or 29 screws. And surgery looked like it had gone beautifully and my leg looked like it was going to be in good shape. And I was kind of already looking forward to recovery and next steps when a couple of days later, infection set in my leg from the open wound on the field. And I developed an infection that turned into necrotizing fasciitis, which is a fancy term for flesh-eating bacteria. And I went into septic shock and At that point, I lost consciousness and went into, a dozen or so surgeries over the next couple of weeks to try to save my life and my leg. When I woke up nearly 2 weeks later and was confronted with the decision to amputate my right leg at that point because they had to remove so much tissue from the infection. And so at that point, confronted with, do I cut my leg off and go on with the rest of my life, or a series of operations that are called limb salvage? They were going to take parts of my body, my healthy parts of my body from my left leg and transfer them down there to my right leg in hope of trying to save it. And I elected for that. I didn't know anything about it. And I elected to have limb salvage surgery, which was several surgeries after that. And there was no guarantee. And I'm fortunate that I had great doctors and they were able to save my leg.
There's a huge amount in what you've just said. And I wonder, you tell it almost factually. Is that, do you have to remove the emotion from it?
Yeah, the funny thing is early on, I was literally not present for a lot of it. When you're going into surgery every single day, the anesthesia for me had an effect that really 2 weeks seemed like a long night's sleep. For me, my wife dealt with the most serious part of that when my life was really in danger. And I woke up to the news nearly 2 weeks later with the reality of what had happened. I didn't want to believe what had happened. I didn't want to believe my present situation and the decision that I was confronted with, cutting off my leg, which definitely was advocated as going to be the safer and easier path. For me, retelling it, like I said, I really wasn't there for a lot of it. And obviously thankful to have an amazing team of doctors and an amazing wife that was able to be there through the toughest part of it.
Reading actually an account from your wife, Elizabeth, it's her not knowing what to do, but these doctors keep saying that, it is this, well, first of all, we'll concentrate on saving his life. And you've gone from her sitting on the sidelines, your family being on the sidelines, seeing the cart come onto the field. And in that moment, yes, it's a difficult injury, right? But then to that point too, I can't understand what she must have been going through in that moment too. As you say, you're out of it, aren't you? You have no idea what's going through.
We were so lucky. I was playing professional sports. I had a long career, and certainly injuries are a part of American football, but you never think your life is going to be in danger because of it. And so I'm completely out of it, and she's trying to save my life the best way, she can, and certainly listening to the experts and the doctors. And I think that they were on the verge, even when I wasn't present, that my leg, amputation was right there on the doorstep. I think for her, advocating for it at some point, because she just wanted to save my life. I can't say how brave she was then and has continued to be through this recovery process. And she's worn so many hats for me and our family throughout that process. But to be thrust into that situation that no one ever expects to be in. You, though, ever the sportsman, there must have been a little part of you still thinking about football. Because I'm right in saying, did they want to take some of the muscle from your throwing arm and you weren't having any of that? That's right. Yeah, they first talked about taking some muscle from my upper body, and I tried to steer them in a different direction. And we finally settled on, they took one of my quad muscles from my left leg, which was still really hard for me to grasp because at that point it was my healthy leg. I thought I can get around at least on one good leg, but now I might have two bad legs. Now you're going to steal from my healthy leg. And it was really hard for me to digest and wrap my head around. But the doctors were confident that I would be able to recover and rebound from it. I'm so thankful, obviously, that I trusted them because I feel as strong as ever in my left leg. And I don't know if I was thinking about football at that point. I was really discouraged and frustrated with it that somehow this game, certainly that I loved and played for a living, had put me in this situation. It wasn't until I got further along in my rehab that I started to think about football again and dare to dream about it. How does that conversation go with your family? Because there's you that's been at risk. You've taken this moment on the field, an injury, seemingly innocuous, yes, a bad break, but it puts your life at risk. They must at that point go, why are you doing this? Why would you want to go back through that? I think early on, football, it was so far away. It was so almost unachievable and impossible that I think obviously my family and those really close to me were encouraging, when I talked about it, when I did finally put it out there that I want to try and see if I can play again. I think the true test, certainly for everybody, especially my wife, was when it got closer and closer. And then certainly when I finally did pass my physical and had the decision right in front of me. As scary and terrifying as it is, that I want to go walk back out on a field with a leg that I just spent 2 years working on and healing and getting stronger and getting back. And I finally was able to do so much with my kids again and my family. And here I wanted to go back out into harm's way. And so thankful again for my wife that in that moment, she allowed me and even granted and pushed me to go pursue it, that she thought I needed to do it for me, and not to have regret and to finish it.
Do you remember what that first hit was like, that first tackle was like?
Yes, and it's going to be hard for me to do it justice. The excitement, the thrill, the exhilaration, combined with the terror, the panic, the fear. Some of these guys out there are so big and strong, and you're the guy back there holding the football every single play, and they're coming to get you. And so that first tackle, like I said, was such a rush of emotions, but the feeling of getting back up from it, knowing that I was okay, knowing that my leg was strong, that I could take a hit, it felt so good. I'd spent 2 years protecting myself, doing anything I could to not put myself in harm's way. And all of a sudden, I was intentionally doing the opposite. And so it felt so good to be able to get up from that first hit.
Then you go on, you win Comeback Player of the Year. I mean, it should have been Decade, really. I think lots of people were saying that for what you went through. And that ending your speech with Just Live as well. What did you mean by that? And how's your perspective changed on things?
In the early part of my career, I spent a lot of time struggling with anxiety and expectations of being a professional athlete, wanting so much the validation of the organization, of the fans. It consumed me. And so it was something I felt like I learned the hard way, that there are a lot of things. Life comes at us all. There's all these external factors that come at us, and life can be hard and unexpected. And a lot of those can be distractions. And so for me, Just Live became a challenge to myself. With all that stuff going on, could I be in the moment and to take the anxiety away from it? None of us are perfect. And to go out there, be present, a little bit fearless, and embrace life, And so for me, that's what Just Live became, especially through my injury, that a lot of times my mind would wander down dark paths, and we all have that self-talk in our head that says a lot of things. And for me to try to eliminate that much as possible and snap back to the present moment and to live each day. And so for me, a challenge that I told myself and continue to tell myself.
Being a dad, you got your hands full anyway.
Yes.
So I'm sure it's been a busy retirement already. But what now? Where do you look to for the future?
For me, I'm just so excited for the unknown, because of my pursuit of football and because I was able to come back. And I think to push those limits of what I never thought was possible. I really never thought that it would go that far. And I'm so lucky that it did. But I still feel like there maybe are no limitations for me out there in life. And I'm anxious to go see and go find out. And I built up so many walls in my head over the course of my recovery about things that I would never be able to do again. And I'm so excited to go take down those walls, and I'm excited to do them with my kids and my wife. My kids are at such a great age that I can go do things with them. I'm thankful every day that I can.
Former Washington quarterback Alex Smith, once #1 draft pick, sharing just a small part of his incredible story. And all the best to Alex and his family for the future. Next on Sports Hour, a moment I thought I'd never experience, let alone on international radio.
Can you give a kiss in the air? No.
Oh,
I think
he's coming in close. He's coming in close.
Yeah.
Oh, look, the first time I've had a bunny kiss. I mean, my life is now complete. That is me kissing a rabbit. Why? Good question. Alex the Great is his name. He's a therapy rabbit who caught the attention of the world after he was spotted in the stands at a San Francisco Giants baseball game. Alex is owned by Kay Cato and Josh Rowe. It was Josh's idea to get the rabbit after Kay lost her restaurant during the pandemic. Alex has now become a bit of a social media sensation after he went to the baseball twice, and the Giants, well, they won both times.
they keep saying, show us bunny, Raleigh bunny. And then there's like a little kid that brought her stuffed animal that looks like Alex. And then some of the people at the baseball game, they're like, oh my gosh, we see people wearing bunny ears and bringing their bunny stuffed toys. And we're like, oh, that's so cute. It kind of like gave that little nice feeling to a lot of the Giants fan in there. We had some few people that came up to us. She had a PSD or something.
Yeah, PSD, yeah.
She's so depressed, and then seeing him, she just started crying in front of us outside the baseball game. She's like, thank you so much for making my day. We hand him over to her, and she started petting him, and she just, tears of joy, she said.
What an incredible roller coaster you've been on. So COVID hits, you lose your businesses, things are hitting you hard. Whose idea was it to go and get Alex, that a therapy rabbit would be the thing that you needed?
I felt like it would be the best thing for her at this point in time. We had thought about a rabbit a couple of times, and I was like, no, it's not right. It's not right. I was like, you know what? We're just going to go do it. He was probably a week too young, but we took him anyways. He took right to us. We babied him. Maybe his weak earliness, but yeah, he came out pretty good.
He's very smart rabbit, adventurous rabbit. That's why we call him Alexander the Great, because he loves exploring. He's not afraid. You know, most rabbits, and I honestly want to let everybody know, he's not your typical rabbit. So don't try this at home, kind of warning. He doesn't get spooked off with loud noises because, you know, he trained him to be exposed to a lot of people at a young age. He's not the type of rabbit that will hide in the corner. Well, right now he's hiding in the corner, falling asleep because he was up late last night and waking us up at 2:00 in the morning for his snacks. This is his normal sleep time.
This is his bedtime. Yeah.
This is when we go to work. So
no, he wonders why you're at home. How does he help you, Kay? How does he help you?
He jumps into my arms, like he'll lay down on my belly or on my underarm and just let me pet him. And then he does his binking. When he's so happy, he binkies around. He knows when I'm like really sad or tired. He's like, Mom, are you okay, Mom? It's not like he just lays down. No, he is like pushing you. Like,
yeah.
Hi, I'm here. You can play with me. I know you're tired. I know you're sad. Come on, let's go. I also mentioned before, like, to my boyfriend here, is like, it's hard to talk now because you don't really have full-on conversation with people anymore. You know, my vocabulary or like the way I talk, sometimes I lose it just because I just stop socializing. So he helps me be more social.
See people.
Yeah, and talk more to people, tell them about him.
Like we are now. Now he's talking to the world, or at least I can see him in the background. He's there. He's engaging. And it's not just you and the rest of the world that's falling in love with him. I hear the Giants now. What's this talk about? They want him to be the new mascot.
I don't know. They haven't really got to me, but I know a lot of the Giants fan want him as a Raleigh bunny. This is our second time, and they won twice every time we were there. So
yeah, on top of that, the actual Giants mascot yesterday took pictures with him, and they posted it on Twitter, and everyone's just like, oh yeah, those two are perfect for each other.
Lou the Seal. We actually got like 1,000 something now on Instagram just because people were like, oh my God, they're so cute, two mascots together.
If you get time next week, have a little look on Instagram because you'll see a picture of Alex the Great in his bow tie and also wearing a little tux, a little waistcoat. When I saw him, I think it was a Peter Rabbit waistcoat. Of course. That was Alex, the therapy rabbit, and Kay and Josh. Next up for Alex is a trip to watch the Golden State Warriors in the NBA. And of course, when we're out of this pandemic, if he was ever to make it to the UK, maybe a trip to the football with me. We can but dream. This is Sports Hour on the BBC World Service, and we've an Olympic star of the future coming up in the next half of the show. But one of the major sports at every Games is swimming, and in Tokyo that will be no different. However, statistics show that there's still an issue in the pool in terms of diversity. Sports Hour's Adam Samuel reports.
Whether you're casually doing a few lengths down your local pool for fun or fitness, or you're an elite athlete, if you're black and you're a swimmer, These types of comments may sound familiar.
Black people can't swim because our bones are heavy. Give me a break. So I am Maritza McClendon, formerly Karaya when I was swimming, but I am a 2004 Olympic silver medalist and the first African-American female to make a U.S. Olympic swim team.
Africans can't swim. You hear that a lot. My name is Osama Melouli. I'm a Tunisian Olympic swimmer, and I have 3 Olympic medals in swimming, 2 gold and a bronze.
You know, afro hair, harder to manage with swimming caps. My name's Alice Deering. I'm 23 years old, and I'm a British marathon swimmer.
3 world-class swimmers of different generations, breaking barriers. Maritza moved from Puerto Rico to the USA at 10 and quickly realised that she was perceived as different within the pool.
If I beat the white kid in the race, they would say something like, why are you here? Like, why don't you go do track and field or something like that? As a 10-year-old hearing that, like, I couldn't understand like why. It was definitely some microaggressions towards me because of the color of my skin. And because I was doing so well, you know, it really made some people uncomfortable, I guess. I felt like I couldn't share that with anybody. Any of my friends on the swim team, none of them were Black. So I couldn't say like, man, this person said this. Can you believe that? Like, I didn't have that. So there was a sense of loneliness.
Meanwhile, in England, Alice, who was mixed race, witnessed discrimination against her fellow club members.
There was an Indian girl in our group. A girl said, oh, I don't want to swim with any of the Indians. I literally just picked up my stuff and moved lane. Like, I didn't know what to do. It was quite confusing, obviously, for a 10-year-old to hear. I think it's the first time I've
Was there ever a point where you felt complete acceptance, or is that something that you strived for but never completely felt?
That's a deep question. It's more like I've always felt accepted, but it's been those times and those situations that have made me question whether I should be accepted. But then I'm so grateful that it's never stopped me from swimming. Like, I've never been beaten down by it too much to be stopped.
To be honest with you, I've never been asked that before. This is like the first time, and I'm months away from the end of my career, and I've been in the sport of swimming internationally for 20 years. I come from a small minority of Arab swimmers and African swimmers. I honestly felt like this is kind of cool, breaking barriers and being the first of my kin to do something like this, the one paving the way.
I felt acceptance when I was swimming really well. So if I was winning and I was getting gold medals, you know, everybody was cheering for me, excited. But the minute I didn't have a great race, I was definitely cast aside. None of us were really in the limelight, in the media, or ever celebrated. So even when I broke that barrier, yeah, there was definitely articles that were released about me being the first, but there was no true like celebration of what a monumental feat that was.
The US Swimming Foundation says 64% of young African Americans can't swim. According to Sport England, 80% of Black British youths don't swim, and there aren't even stats available for Africa. Black aquaphobia is a thing, but with the likes of Aaliyah Atkinson and Simone Manuel claiming medals at major events, a new generation of Black swimmers could be set to leave their mark.
I think the Egyptians are doing a great job. We're doing a great job in Tunisia. I think the Middle East is pushing a little bit in Qatar and Dubai. But the short answer is that we have yet to see bigger representation in the sport of swimming by African swimmers that are non-whites.
It is not an overnight process. You can't just suddenly have like however many people on the British Olympic team being Black or of an ethnic minority. But there's definitely, I think, a change in water with everything that's going on.
I think it's getting better here in the US, especially with the things that are going on. For athletes to have that visual at Tokyo Olympics could definitely be a catalyst to see a surge. Sometimes I've been to a pool and I always see like the same eyes look over like, does she know